Settle in, get comfortable, maybe turn down the lights just a little, pull something warm over your shoulders, and let yourself ease into a world that has been quietly consuming people's attention since 1996. Not because of the jump scares, though there are plenty of those scattered across the timeline, not because of the monsters, though the creatures of this franchise are genuinely extraordinary in their biological imagination, but because somewhere beneath the surface of every door that creaks open in these games, every researcher's diary found half-finished on a blood-stained desk, every character who steps out of one game and never returns to any other, there are questions, dozens of them, layered underneath each other like sediment, each generation of games depositing new mysteries on top of the old ones. Some of them never resolved, some of them perhaps deliberately left open, some of them simply forgotten in the noise of 30 years of storytelling. Tonight we are reaching for 50 of those questions. 50 mysteries from across the entire Resident Evil universe that remain completely unsolved as of right now. Some of them have been sitting there since the very first Spencer mansion. Some of them were planted recently and are already driving the fanbase quietly insane. All of them are worth thinking about in the dark. This is not a recap. You will not find a plot summary here. What you will find is something more like archaeology, a careful excavation of the gaps and silences that make this franchise so much more interesting than its surface suggests. By the time we reach Mystery 50, you are going to understand just how deliberately constructed this world of unanswered questions actually is, and how each loose thread connects to half a dozen others in ways that make the whole thing feel like a single enormous puzzle that Capcom has been slowly assembling across 3 decades. Let the lights go low, find the position your body wants to settle into, and let us begin. Part 1. The Ancient World and What Came Before. The Resident Evil universe did not begin with Umbrella Corporation. It did not begin with Oswell Spencer or James Marcus or Edward Ashford, the 3 men whose names appear on the founding documents. It began in the deep past, in places where human civilization had not yet developed a word for what was growing in the dark. In caves and gardens and underground spaces, where the rules of ordinary biology simply did not apply. The oldest mysteries in this franchise are not about characters or corporate conspiracies. They are about the world itself, about organisms that existed long before anyone was present to study them. And they carry a kind of weight that the later, more plot-driven mysteries never quite achieve, because these are the questions where the answers, if they ever came, would change everything that followed. Mystery 1. Where did the progenitor virus actually come from? The official documented story is that the progenitor virus was formally rediscovered in 1966 by Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford during a 3-month expedition to West Africa. A 19th-century British naturalist named Henry Travis had encountered the stairway to the sunflowers a century earlier and written about them, only to be discredited by institutional science that could not accommodate what he was describing. Marcus, working as a paleovirologist in Switzerland, read Travis's work and developed a hypothesis about a retrovirus being responsible for the flower's effects on the human body. Spencer funded the expedition. They went to West Africa, they found the garden. They were right. That much is documented across the lore of multiple games and supplemental materials. But the question the franchise keeps quietly sidestepping is not how it was discovered. The question is what it actually is. The progenitor virus can infect any organism on the planet. Not just humans, not just mammals. Any organism, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, every form of complex life on Earth is susceptible to it, and no real-world virus comes within light years of that kind of universal biological compatibility. The franchise's own internal research documents describe the progenitor as being potentially billions of years old, a figure that does not describe a conventional pathogen. A virus that is billions of years old is not something that evolved alongside human beings or developed inside a specific animal host. Something that old predates multicellular life. It predates complex nervous systems. It predates everything we conventionally understand as a host organism. The Project Umbrella research analyses that deep readers of the franchise have compiled from in-game files contain a line that the games never develop. If the Sun Garden, the cave in West Africa where the flowers grow, was where the progenitor first appeared, it would make that location the birthplace of all life on Earth. This is not hyperbole for dramatic effect. It is a logical implication of what the virus is described as being. An ancient retrovirus that represents one of the foundational building blocks of biology that existed before complex life emerged, that has been influencing the development of every living thing on this planet for billions of years, is not a pharmaceutical research subject. It is something that should stop the entire scientific world in its tracks. The franchise raised this idea and then walked away from it. The ancient caves of West Africa that Spencer's men pushed the Ndapaya people out of in 1968 to establish a research laboratory, the Garden of Flowers that all of Umbrella's research ultimately traces back to, the specific environmental conditions that made that particular location and no other place on Earth capable of producing the virus in its natural form, all of these things point toward an origin story far larger and far older than anything the games have been willing to tell. The question of where the progenitor actually came from, what it is at a cosmological level, what its relationship is to life itself, remains the single most significant unanswered question in the franchise. Mystery 2. What destroyed the Ndapaya civilization? The Ndapaya people built something remarkable inside and around the Sun Garden. The lore describes their civilization as having achieved extraordinary architectural sophistication, with engineering knowledge that their descendants carried into the modern world, and that was recognized globally without anyone understanding its origin. They accomplished this because their warrior kings, the rare individuals who survived consuming the stairway to the sunflowers, gained the enhanced intellect and extended lifespan that progenitor adaptation provided. A king who lived for hundreds of years, who experienced centuries of accumulated knowledge rather than decades, who had the enhanced cognitive capacity that progenitor supercharges into extraordinary ability, would indeed produce a civilization of unusual advancement. And then the Ndapaya were reduced to a remnant. By the time Spencer arrived in 1966, their ancient city was in ruins. The garden was sealed. Their knowledge of the flowers had become ceremonial, a religious rite whose original purpose had been obscured by the generations between the civilization's peak and its collapse. They were still there. They were still human. But whatever had made them exceptional was gone, locked away in a sealed cave that they chose not to access, even when the outside world came to take it from them. Something destroyed the Ndapaya civilization from within. The fragments of lore that address this describe mutated animals that consumed the progenitor flowers and became dangerous enough to overrun the city, forcing the inhabitants to seal the garden and abandon large portions of their built environment. This explanation exists but raises more questions than it settles. If your king is a progenitor human with centuries of experience and superhuman physical capability, what animals are difficult enough to require abandoning your city? What specific combination of mutations would be severe enough to overwhelm an ancient military force that presumably had experience dealing with the effects of the virus? And crucially, if some of the Ndapaya's warrior kings had achieved biological immortality through full progenitor adaptation, where did those individuals go when the city fell? An adapted progenitor human cannot be killed by conventional means and does not age. If even one such individual existed among the Ndapaya at the time of the city's collapse, that person would have survived. They would have been alive when Spencer arrived in 1966. They would be alive in the present day of the franchise timeline. They would have watched Umbrella establish its research facility in their sacred garden. They would have watched everything that followed. If a progenitor human from the Ndapaya civilization exists somewhere in the world of Resident Evil, watching events unfold from a perspective that spans thousands of years, their potential role in the franchise's ongoing story is one that has never been acknowledged. Mystery 3. The Megamycete's true age and full extent. Resident Evil Village introduced the Megamycete, the ancient fungal supercolony beneath the mountains of Eastern Europe that Miranda discovered in 1919. The lore gives us some temporal anchor points. There are signs of mold activity in the region going back to the 15th century at least, documented in historical records as monstrous transformations that local communities interpreted as demonic possession. The fungus had been consuming the dead from that mountain range for centuries, archiving their consciousness in the mycelial network. But the Megamycete's underground structure suggests a development timeline much older than the 15th century. Fungal networks of that scale and complexity require time, significant time, The cave system it occupies shows signs of organic reshaping, the stone itself having been influenced by centuries of growth. The central mass is described as architectural in its density, something that accumulated mass across a period long enough for it to become part of the geography rather than simply a resident within it. How old is the Megamycete actually? The franchise does not say. And the question matters because every person who died in those mountains during the fungus's entire lifespan contributed to the archive. If it predates the region's Christian settlement, it predates Slavic settlement of the area, predates Roman expansion, predates written history in that corner of Europe, then the archive contains consciousness from periods of human history for which we have no other record. People who lived and died in those mountains during the prehistoric period, whose thoughts and memories and experiences have been preserved in a fungal network under the earth for thousands of years. Warrior cultures, Stone Age communities, individuals who never left any trace in the archaeological record because the archive absorbed them before they could. There is also the question of the Megamycete's geographic reach. Its network extends through the mountain range, connecting underground to different elevations and different valleys. That network was still actively growing when Miranda found it. It presumably continued growing during her century of research in the area. It may have reached locations significantly beyond what the events of Village account for. Whether the Megamycete's total archive, the full scope of every consciousness it ever preserved, was entirely destroyed in the explosion, or whether fragments of the network survived in places no one knew to look for, is a question the franchise has not addressed. Rose interacts with what is described as a salvaged fragment in Shadows of Rose, which means the destruction of the central mass did not eliminate everything. There are living pieces of that archive still in the world. Mystery 4. How many natural progenitor humans exist today? The lore establishes clearly that some humans carry a genetic configuration that allows their bodies to adapt to progenitor infection rather than die from it. The Indipaya identified this through their ritual of survival and selection. Spencer and Marcus identified it as the basis for the Wesker project. Wesker himself is the most prominent modern example of a natural progenitor human, someone whose specific genetic inheritance included the compatibility markers that allowed survival and enhancement. But compatibility is genetic, which means it is heritable, which means it is distributed across the human population wherever the descendants of compatible individuals have spread across thousands of years of human migration and reproduction. The Indipaya warrior kings who successfully adapted to the virus had descendants who carried those genetic markers into other populations. The specific bloodlines that progenitor affects differently have been intermixing with general humanity for millennia. Spencer attempted to identify these individuals through Project W, selecting children based on their parents' exceptional capabilities as a proxy for genetic potential. But Project W was a small program selecting from an elite subset of humanity. The broader population of people who carry natural progenitor compatibility has never been identified or counted. They are living in the world of Resident Evil right now, going about their lives with no idea that their genome includes something extraordinary. They have probably encountered T-virus derivatives in various outbreak events across the franchise timeline and simply survived while others around them did not, attributing their survival to luck rather than biology. What would happen if one of these unidentified natural progenitor humans were deliberately infected with a refined progenitor strain? Not the hybrid bioweapons that the T-virus and its derivatives represent, but something close to the original flower-derived viral form? Would they adapt the way ancient Indipaya kings adapted? Would they develop the longevity and enhanced capabilities that defined those ancient rulers? And if any organization in the franchise became aware that these naturally compatible individuals exist, the incentive to find and exploit them would be extraordinary. The franchise has established that these people are out there. It has never shown us what happens when someone finds one. Mystery 5. The Sun Garden after 2009. After Tricell's operations in West Africa were exposed during the events of Resident Evil 5, the BSAA arrived to contain the situation. The Africa Laboratory, the location that Spencer had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal after Umbrella's collapse, was presumably now in the BSAA's awareness, if not their full control. The Sun Garden, The original cave system where the progenitor flowers grow sits at the center of this facility. The virus produced by those flowers in their natural environment cannot be cultivated elsewhere. Decades of umbrella research confirm that removing the flowers from their specific location, their specific soil chemistry, and underground atmosphere prevented viral expression entirely. The flowers could survive transplantation. The virus they carried could not, which means the sun garden is the only place in the world where progenitor in its purest natural form can be obtained. In a franchise where organizations have gone to catastrophic lengths to acquire viral samples, where the black market for biological agents is described as globally active and completely unconstrained by the collapse of any individual company, the progenitor source location should be the most contested piece of real estate on Earth. Every government with a bioweapons program would want it. Every private organization operating in the bioterrorism sphere would want it. Every research institution studying the long-term effects of Umbrella's legacy would want access to it. The franchise has simply stopped mentioning it. After 2009, after the events of Resident Evil 5, the Sun Garden disappears from the narrative, as if the question of who controls it were completely settled. The BSAA containing it is not a sufficient answer in a world where the BSAA itself has been revealed as compromised. The story of what has happened to that specific location, to the original source of every pathogen in the franchise's history, remains completely untold. Before we move further into the mystery, a small pause. If you are watching this right now from somewhere interesting, from a rainy night in a city you love, from a quiet room while the rest of the house is asleep, from a long drive or a night shift or somewhere tucked away and genuinely comfortable, drop the time and place in the comments. Tell us where you are. And if this kind of slow, thorough lore excavation is the reason you are here, hit subscribe so you catch the next one. We do a lot of these. There is always more to find. Now, let us go deeper. Part 2. The Founders and Their Buried Secrets. Umbrella Corporation casts its shadow across every game in the franchise even now, decades after its legal dissolution. The three men who built it, Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford, made decisions in the 1960s that directly caused events in the 2020s. Their motivations, their individual research agendas, their relationships with each other, all of these have been addressed in pieces across multiple games without ever being fully assembled into a coherent picture. The gaps in their story are not minor, they are structural. Mystery 6. What James Marcus experienced during 20 years as a leech colony. James Marcus is responsible for the T virus. He combined progenitor with leech DNA after discovering that leeches could survive infection and develop in ways that other organisms could not. He was Spencer and Ashford's co-founder. He ran the Umbrella Executive Training Facility. He was one of the most brilliant researchers in the franchise's history, and in 1978, after Wesker and Birkin gathered enough evidence of his illegal experiments on trainees to give Spencer justification, he was shot by Umbrella operatives and left for dead. Except Marcus had spent years working intimately with leeches. The queen leech in his colony had absorbed enough of his genetic material, his behavioral patterns, his emotional responses, his mental architecture, that when his consciousness began to disperse at the moment of death, it had somewhere to go. The leech colony absorbed him. His awareness persisted inside a distributed organism that had no brain, no conventional nervous system, no structure that should be capable of maintaining coherent thought. Resident Evil 0 shows us what emerged from this process in 1998, 20 years after the assassination. A Marcus-shaped entity, recognizably him in personality and motivation, driven by fury at Spencer's betrayal, focused on revenge through the mechanism of triggering the Arklay laboratory outbreak. The entity functioned. It remembered. It planned. But what was the experience of being inside a leech colony for 20 years? The franchise asks this question implicitly and never addresses it. Was there continuity of consciousness across those 2 decades? Did Marcus experience time passing? Was he aware of what was happening around him in those years? The facility where his leeches were kept would have continued operating, other researchers working nearby, the facility's routines continuing. Was he present for all of that, trapped in a form of awareness that he could not express or communicate? Was there a period where he was not aware, where his consciousness existed only as stored information in the colony's biology, the way Eva's consciousness existed in the Megamycete, waiting for the right conditions to reconstitute itself. The parallel between Marcus and the Megamycete's consciousness storage is one the franchise has never drawn explicitly, but the biological mechanism may be similar. Consciousness preserved in non-human biological tissue, maintained through a form of information storage that human neuroscience has no framework for. If Marcus and Ethan and Eva and anyone else the Megamycete ever held all represent the same phenomenon, the same capability of biology to hold the pattern of a person past their physical death, then there is a unified theory here that the franchise keeps approaching from different directions without ever stating directly. Mystery 7. Edward Ashford's true research direction before his death. Edward Ashford's death in 1968 from direct progenitor exposure is one of the franchise's founding tragedies, an ironic ending for one of the 3 men responsible for bringing the virus to the world's attention. He was the first Westerner to die from it. He died establishing the research program that would eventually kill millions of people, without ever having the opportunity to see what that program became. His descendants, his son Alexander and Alexander's engineered children Alfred and Alexia, spent their lives working in the specific context of the Antarctic facility that Edward never lived to see built. Alexander's Code, Veronica Project, was focused on cloning the exceptional genetics of the Ashford bloodline. Alexia's T. Veronica virus combined progenitor with queen ant DNA. The specific direction of the Ashford research program, focused on genetics and heredity rather than on weaponization, suggests that Edward Ashford had a theoretical framework that differed meaningfully from both Marcus and Spencer. Marcus wanted to understand the virus's biological mechanisms. Spencer wanted to use it to force human evolution. What did Ashford want? His descendants' obsession with bloodline restoration, with identifying and preserving what made certain humans exceptional, sounds less like Spencer's crude eugenics and more like something closer to genuine biological conservation. He may have been interested in identifying and protecting what makes human potential extraordinary rather than in weaponizing it. If that is the correct reading of the Ashford research tradition, then the franchise contains within its history a branch of progenitor study that was fundamentally different in intention from everything else that emerged from those early years. And that branch died with Edward, was distorted by Alexander's descent into obsession, and was ultimately buried under Alexia's catastrophic self-experimentation. The legitimate version of Ashford's work, whatever it might have produced in a different history, is one of the franchise's great roads not taken. Mystery 8. The complete accounting of the Wesker Children Project W involved hundreds of children before it reached its final 13 candidates. Hundreds of young people were selected, given the Wesker surname, provided with the best education money could arrange, guided into careers useful to Spencer's vision, and monitored throughout their entire lives without their knowledge or consent. The scale of this program is genuinely staggering when you sit with it. Not 13 people, hundreds. Selected based on criteria that none of them knew about, shaped by an institutional hand they could not see, living entire lives that were architecturally designed by someone else. Of the hundreds, 13 were eventually selected for infection. 11 of those 13 died. The 2 survivors, Albert and Alex, are the only Wesker children whose stories the franchise has told with any detail. But what about the hundreds who never reached the final stage? They grew up. They had careers. They presumably had families. They lived in the world not knowing that their entire developmental arc had been engineered. And at some point, probably after Umbrella's collapse in 2003, they found out. Or some of them did. Or perhaps they've never found out at all, and the knowledge died with Spencer. What is the psychological experience of learning as an adult? That your childhood education, your career guidance, your sense of self as a person of unusual capability was all the product of someone else's breeding experiment? That you were selected as genetic material to be developed and tested? That the parents who gave you up for adoption, or the circumstances that led to your placement in your particular life, were arranged by a corporate entity that viewed you as an asset? There are hundreds of people in the Resident Evil timeline who carry that story. None of them have been characters in any game. Mystery 9. The full scope of Spencer's God Emperor plan, Spencer's endgame was spectacular in its ambition and completely unspecified in its operational details. He wanted to engineer a race of superhuman beings through progenitor adaptation, release Ouroboros to purge the incompatible majority of humanity, and be worshipped as the father of the new species. This was not a vague ambition. It was a specific plan that he spent decades and extraordinary resources developing. The monologue in which Spencer reveals all of this to Wesker moments before being murdered is one of those scenes that gives you the shape of the villain's vision without the operational substance. He tells Wesker what he wanted. He does not explain how he expected it to work logistically. The transition from 8 billion people to 7,000 progenitor humans, whatever that transition looks like in practice, involves a period of global civilization collapse that Spencer had presumably thought through in detail. He needed infrastructure to survive that period. He needed protected locations where the Ouroboros release would not reach. He needed some mechanism for gathering and identifying the surviving compatible individuals after the culling. He needed, in other words, a plan that was much more specific than anything revealed in the games. Spencer was a meticulous institutional organizer. He built Umbrella from the ground up. He ran Project W for decades. He managed the complex political and financial operations required to protect Umbrella's illegal activities across multiple countries. He did not have vague ambitions. He had detailed operational plans. And those plans, the specific logistics of how he intended to become god of a new human race, died with him in that chair before Wesker's hands closed around his throat. Mystery 10. Who was behind Blue Umbrella's founding? Blue Umbrella emerged after Umbrella's dissolution as a private military contractor focused on bioterrorism response. They use the Umbrella name and logo, they employ Chris Redfield in Resident Evil 7, and they present themselves as a force for good. The franchise treats them as essentially trustworthy within that specific context, which is an unusual stance for a series that has spent 3 decades demonstrating that organizations using Umbrella's visual identity should be viewed with absolute suspicion. The specific individuals who founded Blue Umbrella and who control it have never been identified in any game. The name itself is a deliberate callback that demands explanation. Someone chose to maintain that branding. That choice either reflects irony, claiming the name of history's greatest bioterrorism organization to signal that it has been neutralized, or it reflects something more complicated, a continuity with the original that the public framing deliberately obscures. In a franchise where every organization eventually proves to have hidden agendas and compromised leadership, Blue Umbrella's presentation as a straightforward good-faith bioterrorism response unit is either genuinely exceptional or is the most sophisticated misdirection in the series. The village post-credits scene, showing Chris's discovery that BSAA soldiers are BOWs, does not implicate Blue Umbrella directly, but it does establish that organizations Chris trusts can be compromised in ways he does not know about. Whether that applies to his Blue Umbrella affiliation is a question that hangs over everything he has done in recent franchise entries. Mystery 11. Umbrella's research that we never saw. Umbrella Corporation operated research facilities across multiple continents for approximately 35 years. The Arklay Laboratory, the training facility, the Antarctic base, the Africa Laboratory, the Raccoon City Laboratory, and various European branches constitute only the facilities the games have directly depicted. An organization of this scale, with this funding and this research mandate, would have had dozens more. What was happening in the facilities the games never visited? The Tyrant series is Umbrella's flagship product line, and the games show us specific stages of its development. But the development process involves years of prototyping, failed experiments, discarded design directions. What other bioweapon programs did Umbrella run that never reached deployment? What research directions did individual laboratories pursue that Spencer shut down as counterproductive or that produced results too dangerous to control? What was being worked on in facilities that were quietly closed, in programs whose documentation was classified even from most of Umbrella's own employees? The UMF-013, Umbrella's central archive, contained the complete institutional record. Wesker copied it. Whatever is in that archive beyond what the games have disclosed is sitting somewhere in the Resident Evil world, waiting to be found by whoever has the right access to the right systems. The franchise keeps implying the existence of Umbrella secrets that have not been revealed. The existence of the archive gives those implied secrets a physical location without telling us their content. Part 3. The Lost Survivors. One of the most reliable patterns in Resident Evil storytelling is the introduction of a character compelling enough to earn genuine audience investment, followed by that character simply never appearing again. Not killed, not retired, simply set aside, their story technically continuing in the world of the franchise, while the games decline to continue telling it. These absences accumulate over 30 years into something that feels less like oversight and more like a gallery of unfinished portraits. Mystery 12. Where is Billy Cohen right now? Billy Cohen's story in Resident Evil 0 is complete in one sense and completely unresolved in every other. He was a Marine convicted of killing 23 civilians. He escaped his death sentence when the transport vehicle carrying him to execution was attacked by infected creatures. He met Rebecca Chambers. Together they survived the Umbrella training facility outbreak, discovered that Marcus's research had been behind everything, and emerged into a world that still had a murder conviction with his name on it and no mechanism to clear him. Rebecca let him go. That is the game's conclusion. She could not clear his name, but she chose not to capture him, choosing to believe in his innocence based on what they experienced together. He walked into the woods and was not seen again. Billy Cohen has direct knowledge of James Marcus's research, of the Umbrella training facility, of the earliest developmental stages of the T-virus. He was present at the beginning of the outbreak that eventually led to Raccoon City. He is alive in the franchise timeline, carrying information that would be relevant to multiple ongoing investigations. He is also living under an assumed identity somewhere, because returning to his real one means returning to a death sentence for crimes he did not commit. The specific information Billy carries about the training facility's research would be valuable to any BSAA investigation. The question of whether he ever made contact with anyone who could use that information, whether he ever found a way to clear his name, whether the exposure of Umbrella's activities in subsequent years provided enough context for his conviction to be reviewed, has simply never been addressed. He is one of the franchise's most genuinely sympathetic characters, given the most unresolved ending of any major protagonist. Mystery 13. Carlos Oliveira's life after Raccoon City. Carlos is genuinely funny and warm in a franchise that trends toward grim determination and quiet suffering. He is charming in a way that feels unforced. His scenes with Jill in Resident Evil 3 carry genuine emotional weight. And he made it out. He survived. He escaped Raccoon City before the missile struck. The Carlos who walked out of Raccoon City carried knowledge of UBCS operations, of Nikolai's data collection mission, of Umbrella's deliberate decision to deploy mercenaries with the secondary mission of gathering combat performance data on the BOWs rather than actually rescuing civilians. He knew the mission had been a setup from the start. He knew that the people he had been fighting alongside were expendable assets in an Umbrella research program. What does a person do with that knowledge in the immediate aftermath of watching a city get bombed? His epilogue card from the original game says he continued mercenary work. That is a broad description of a life, not a characterization. Has he been working in bioterrorism response? Has he made contact with any of the organizations that emerged after Umbrella? Has he encountered any of the other survivors from Raccoon City who are scattered across the franchise's timeline? The remake gave him more dimensionality and more screen time, which makes his subsequent complete absence from the franchise feel more pointed rather than less. Mystery 14. Where are Sherry Birkin and Jake Muller? Sherry Birkin's story spans 15 years of franchise timeline, from the terrified child running through Raccoon City's burning streets in 1998 to the capable DSO agent partnering with Jake Muller in 2013. Across those 15 years, she developed from a traumatized survivor into someone who channeled her experience into active resistance against the threats she understands from the inside. The G-virus adaptation she carries gives her regenerative capabilities that make her essentially biologically immortal. She is going to be alive in the Resident Evil timeline for as long as the franchise chooses to tell stories. Jake Muller is Albert Wesker's biological son and carries the genetic inheritance of Wesker's progenitor adaptation, which made his blood the basis for a potential C-virus antigen. After the events of Resident Evil 6, he made the choice to help others rather than profit from his capabilities, departing to assist communities affected by bioterrorism incidents. Neither of them has appeared since. The franchise has spent significant narrative investment on both characters and then placed them on a shelf. Jake's Wesker genetics have ongoing implications for any future research into progenitor adaptation. Sherry's G-virus adaptation is still active and still changing, presumably, because the G-virus is not a static infection. The specific state of her biology after 15 more years of adaptation development is something the games have not addressed. These are two characters whose stories have enormous remaining potential, and whose absence from recent games feels like a deliberate reservation rather than abandonment. But the longer that reservation continues, the more awkward the eventual explanation for their absence will need to be. Mystery 15. The post-credits figure in the RE3 remake. The 2020 Resident Evil 3 remake closes with one of the most analyzed brief scenes in the franchise's recent history. After everything that happens, after Jill defeats Nemesis and escapes Raccoon City, the game shows a post-credits scene lasting only a few seconds. A figure wearing green enters a room. They pick up a broken vial from a desk. The shot ends. That is the entirety of the scene. No dialogue, no identification, no context. Just a figure in green, a broken vial, and a choice by the filmmakers to end there rather than show what the figure does next. The broken vial being on a desk in a room after a bioterrorism incident implies it was there intentionally, not simply dropped in chaos. Desks are not where things fall during zombie outbreaks. They are where researchers leave things, where evidence is placed, where objects with specific significance are set down by people who know what they represent. Someone placed something relevant in that room before everything went wrong. What it contained, what it represented to whoever placed it there, whether it was destroyed in the breaking or merely released, forms one half of the mystery. The figure in green forms the other. They came to find it specifically. They knew where to look. And the color of their clothing, green being Rebecca Chambers' signature color, has kept the speculation going for years without resolution. Mystery 16. Raymond and Jessica's employer, Resident Evil Revelations, placed two double agents in its cast without ever revealing who they were ultimately working for. Raymond Vester faked his death during the events on the Queen Zenobia. Jessica Sharawat was revealed to be a mole within the BSAA. Their post-credits meeting at a cafe, where Raymond passes her a T-Abyss virus sample and references a pleased employer, closes the game on a hook that has never been followed up. Their employer exists. They are described with enough specificity to constitute a distinct organization. They have resources sufficient to place operatives inside the BSAA. They are interested in viral samples rather than deployment for its own sake, and they operate with enough patience to maintain long-term moles in institutional positions. These are not the characteristics of a hastily assembled criminal network. This is an organization with a strategic vision and the operational capacity to execute it over years. The T-Abyss sample Raymond delivered is somewhere. The organization that received it has had well over a decade to study it. If they were capable of placing operatives inside the BSA in 2005, their capabilities have presumably developed since then. They are in the world of the franchise, conducting activities the games have not shown us, and the specific nature of what they are building toward with their collection of viral samples has never been addressed. Mystery 17. The real story behind Hunk Hunk is the only major recurring playable character in the franchise, whose real name, real age, real nationality, and real history before Umbrella are completely unknown. Every other character with significant screen time has at least a partial biography assembled from in-game files, supplemental materials, and inter-character dialogue. Hunk has none of these things. His codename is a designation, not a name. His backstory is a blank. The earliest period of his life and how he came to be the leader of USS Alpha Team are completely undocumented. What the lore confirms is remarkable enough on its own. He successfully retrieved the G-virus sample in 1998, while every other member of his team died. He survived Raccoon City during the height of the outbreak, navigating through zombie-filled sewers and streets for days before extraction. He apparently survived every mission he was ever assigned. The The nickname Mr. Death reflects the specific quality of his survival record, which is not simply that he lives, but that everyone around him dies while he does not. This pattern is consistent across multiple separate incidents, which moves it from extraordinary luck into something that requires a different kind of explanation. Fan theories about Hunk's actual nature have occupied Resident Evil discussion spaces for years. The most persistent is that he is biologically enhanced in some manner that exceeds conventional human capability without constituting full progenitor adaptation. Something that accelerates healing, sharpens situational awareness, or provides a level of physiological resilience that makes him capable of surviving circumstances that kill ordinary humans. The franchise has neither confirmed nor denied this. It has simply maintained the mystery with such consistency that it appears to be an active creative choice rather than a gap in planning. Part 4. The viruses and what we still do not know. The biological agents of Resident Evil constitute one of the most elaborately detailed fictional scientific systems in the history of the medium. Each virus has development history, specific mechanisms, known variants, and documented failure modes. The amount of in-game documentation devoted to explaining how these things work is extraordinary. But the documentation is always incomplete. There are always the questions it raises without answering, the gaps that appear most clearly at the moments when you read the files most carefully and realize that something is being left out. Mystery 18. What would Ouroboros' global release have actually produced? Wesker's plan in Resident Evil 5 was to release Ouroboros into the Earth's atmosphere to perform a forced natural selection event at planetary scale. The compatible individuals, the genetic lottery winners who carried whatever specific biological configuration allowed survival, would transform into progenitor humans. Everyone else would die. The game is entirely correct to focus on stopping this. But the question of what would have followed, even if you accept Wesker's projection that the outcome would eventually be positive for the survivors, has never been examined. His estimate for natural compatibility with progenitor, based on decades of Umbrella research, suggested roughly 1 in a million survival rates. 7,000 people with enhanced capabilities living in the ruins of a world built for 7 billion. The infrastructure problem alone is catastrophic beyond easy comprehension. The power grid requires constant maintenance by thousands of specialists distributed across every node in the system. It fails within days of losing those workers, not years. Within weeks of civilization's collapse, the nuclear facilities currently operating across the planet begin presenting containment problems that no 7,000-person population could address. The medical infrastructure that manages chronic illness, the agricultural infrastructure that feeds populations, the basic maintenance requirements of a modern built environment, all of it requires a workforce that a surviving population of 7,000 cannot provide. Wesker envisioned a utopia. He would have produced an extinction event slightly more drawn out than the one he was trying to prevent, with the survivors dying not from Ouroboros, but from the cascading collapse of everything supporting human life on a technological planet. His plan was not coherent even in its own terms, and the franchise, being focused on stopping him rather than analyzing him, never had the space to point this out. Mystery 19. The 10% with natural T-virus immunity. Spencer himself acknowledged in his research documentation that approximately 10% of the human population carries natural immunity to the T-virus. This is one of those franchise details that sits quietly in a background file and has massive implications if you follow it through to its logical conclusion. Raccoon City, at the time of the 1998 outbreak, had a population of approximately 100,000 people. 10% natural immunity would be 10,000 individuals who could not be infected by the T-virus, regardless of exposure level, regardless of how directly they encountered infected individuals, regardless of any environmental contamination. These people were present during the outbreak. They watched their neighbors, their families, their colleagues transform into something unrecognizable. They experienced the terror without experiencing the infection. 10,000 immune individuals in a city experiencing an active zombie outbreak face a unique set of survival challenges. They are not in danger from the virus itself, but they are surrounded by creatures that will attack them regardless of their immunity. They cannot communicate their status to other survivors because no one in 1998 Raccoon City had a way to test or verify T-virus immunity. They are functionally indistinguishable from anyone else to both the infected and the uninfected. The canonical historical record says that almost everyone in Raccoon City died before the missile strike, but almost everyone is not everyone. Even accounting for direct physical attacks by the infected, some percentage of those 10,000 immune individuals, the ones who found shelter quickly, who had the physical capability to survive the combat without the virus making their situation worse, should have survived long enough to be evacuated or to escape on their own. What happened to them? The franchise has never addressed the Raccoon City immune population as a distinct group. Mystery 20. What happened to the original Las Plagas strain? Resident Evil 4's Las Plagas parasites came from a specific ecological context, a Spanish rural region where a religious organization had been cultivating and studying the organism for generations. The plagas integrated with the local human population to produce the ganados, a form of controlled infection distinct from zombie mutations because it preserved cognitive function while enabling external direction of behavior. Los Illuminados had developed techniques for controlling infected populations at scale. Leon recovered a plaga sample for the U.S. government. Ada Wong recovered a separate sample for her anonymous employer. The original plagas population in that Spanish region existed across thousands of hosts at the time of Leon's mission. The game's conclusion involves Leon and Ashley escaping after Sadler's death, but the story does not provide a clear accounting of what happened to the infected villagers, the castle staff, the military forces under plaga control. Were they all killed during the events of the game? Did some escape the final events with plagas still active in their bodies? Did the detonation of the island facility represent the end of the plaga program, or simply one incident within a larger story? The derivative of Las Plagas that eventually contributed to the C virus in Resident Evil 6 suggests that the original strain's genetic information made it into subsequent research somewhere. The specific path from the Spanish plagas to the C virus's development and who held the samples during that journey has never been fully documented. Mystery 21. The G virus's theoretical final form. The G virus is described in the franchise as an organism designed for continuous mutation. Its host does not reach a stable infected state and remain there. It continues changing, cycling through forms that become progressively less recognizable as human with each stage of mutation. The Birkin creature in Resident Evil 2 goes through 5 documented forms during the events of the game, each one less humanoid than the last, each one representing a different phase of the G virus's developmental agenda. The game kills Birkin before this process can continue beyond Stage 5. But the G virus's design does not indicate that Stage 5 is the end point. It simply indicates that 5 is where the game needed to end for narrative reasons. If Birkin had survived to continue mutating, what would Stages 6, 7, 10, 20 have looked like? Is there a terminal form that the G virus is working toward? Some final configuration of biological matter that represents the completion of what the virus is trying to build? The G virus is unique among the franchise's pathogens in being explicitly described as having its own agenda, its own developmental trajectory that it imposes on whatever host it occupies. Every other major virus causes mutation in ways that can be roughly predicted based on the base biology of the host. The G virus appears to have a destination, a specific goal it is working toward in every host it occupies. What that destination is has never been described. Mystery 22. The T-Abyss virus's development history. The T-Abyss virus from Revelations is a progenitor derivative combined with deep-sea organism DNA, producing mutations with aquatic characteristics in infected hosts. The conceptual leap of adapting progenitor to a specific biological environment by incorporating the genetic material of organisms evolved for that environment is not something Umbrella's original research program pursued. It represents a distinct research tradition, someone taking the foundational principles of what Marcus and Birkin developed and applying them in a direction that neither would have chosen. The eco-terrorist organization responsible for T-Abyss development did this without the institutional support of Umbrella's laboratory network, without the decades of accumulated research that made the main progenitor derivatives possible. They took existing knowledge and extended it in a new direction, which implies that their researchers had either accessed Umbrella's development documentation or had independently arrived at the same methodological approaches. The specific individuals who did this work have never appeared in any game. The organization itself is given a bare outline without institutional depth. The development history of T-Abyss, what experiments were run, what failed versions looked like, what population of test subjects was used to develop the final strain, is completely absent. And the sample that ended up in Raymond and Jessica's hands at the end of Revelations is still somewhere, still biologically active, still in the possession of a party that has never been identified. Mystery 23. Who really controls the C-virus research legacy? The C-virus was the most sophisticated pathogen ever created in the franchise's documented history, capable of producing customized mutations based on administration method, flexible enough to be deployed in multiple configurations for different operational purposes. Its development involved combining G-virus material with a Plaga derivative in a way that no single organization had the resources to accomplish independently. Neo Umbrella's scientific program, which developed the C-virus, was funded through a complex chain of organizational relationships that ultimately traced back to Derek Simmons and the family. Simmons is dead. The family presumably still exists. The research teams that developed the C-virus were employed by organizations that either dissolved or went underground after the events of Resident Evil 6. But the methodology is not gone with the organizations. Researchers who worked on the C-virus carried that knowledge with them when they walked out of whatever facility employed them. The specific combination of G-virus and Plaga genetics that produced the C-virus represents a repeatable process. Given access to both component pathogens and the methodological knowledge of how to combine them, the C-virus can be recreated. Whether anyone has attempted to do so since 2013 is a question the franchise has not addressed. Part 5. The creatures and their hidden stories. Every monster in Resident Evil has a history. The games are generous with documentation about what specific pathogens produce specific creatures, what research programs they emerged from, what the researchers working on them intended. But the documentation always stops just short of answering every question. The specific moment where information runs out is often the most interesting part of the creature's story. Mystery 24. The other 3 Nemesis specimens, supplemental lore attached to Resident Evil 3, confirms that the Nemesis T-type program at Umbrella Europe produced 4 individual specimens. The game follows 1. A second specimen is described as having developed enough awareness of its situation to attempt escape before it was terminated by Umbrella as a containment risk. 2 remain unaccounted for. Let that sit for a moment. 2 Nemesis T-type specimens, the most advanced and dangerous biological weapon Umbrella ever produced before Ouroboros, exist somewhere in the franchise's timeline with no documented fate. They may have been deployed. They may have been stored in facilities that were abandoned after Raccoon City. They may have been sold on the black market that emerged after Umbrella's collapse. They may currently be in the possession of whatever organization bought them, sitting in climate-controlled containment somewhere, waiting. The specific capabilities of the Nemesis T-type make this more than academic speculation. It is described as exceeding the Tyrant series in terms of capability. It can follow complex strategic directives. It can recognize specific targets. It can use weapons. It is nearly indestructible through conventional means. 2 of these things existing somewhere in the world, with their location unaccounted for, is the kind of detail that should define someone's entire research agenda. The franchise mentions it and moves on. Mystery 25. The full Tyrant development catalog. The Tyrant series is Umbrella's flagship product line. The T-002, the T-103 mass production model, the Nemesis T-type, and various experimental variants are the ones the franchise has documented in any detail. But the development process for the Tyrant program spans approximately 15 years from the early prototypes to the mass production models that end up in the hands of military clients. 15 years of continuous development at multiple research facilities simultaneously produces a lot of models that are not the final version. Prototypes, dead ends, variants that worked in some respects but failed in others, experimental configurations that were abandoned for reasons of cost or controllability or production difficulty. Some of these variants would have been destroyed in testing. Others may have been stored. Others may have been sold as developmental products to clients who wanted something other than the mass production standard. The complete catalog of what tyrant variants existed, which ones were built and which existed only in design documentation, and what happened to the physical specimens across all of them is a gap in the franchise's documented history wide enough to drive a truck through. The black market for bow technology that the franchise describes as thriving after Umbrella's collapse would logically include developmental tyrant specimens. Whether any of them are still active, still contained, or still in someone's possession has never been addressed. Mystery 26. The Arklay Mountains Ecosystem Contamination. The T-virus outbreak at the Arklay Laboratory in May 1998 spread through the local water supply and infected the forest ecosystem across the entire mountain range outside Raccoon City. By July, when STARS arrived to investigate, the infections had been spreading for 2 months through an active ecological system. Zombie dogs, crow mutations, giant spiders, zombie bears, and various other wildlife mutations were active throughout the forest. The contamination was not confined to the mansion. Raccoon City was destroyed in October 1998. The missile strike that ended the city's outbreak was targeted at the urban area. The Arklay Mountains are outside Raccoon City, not inside it. The infected forest ecosystem was not within the blast radius. The infected wildlife population in those mountains did not stop being infected because someone destroyed the city downstream. Wildlife moves. Rivers carry water out of mountains and into different systems. Scavengers and predators migrate across large territories. An active T-virus ecosystem in a mountain range adjacent to a major populated area would represent a persistent contamination source for weeks or months after the primary urban outbreak was destroyed. Whether the Arklay infection burned out naturally, was contained by a secondary operation, or actually spread further before eventually collapsing is a question the franchise has never answered. The mountain range the first game took place in exists in the subsequent story as if the ecological contamination simply resolved itself off-screen. Mystery 27. What the Regeneradors experienced, Resident Evil 4's Regeneradors represent a level of plaga manipulation that exceeds anything else seen in the game's infected population. They were once human beings. The process that transformed them stripped away their skin, externalized elements of their physiology, and saturated their bodies with plaga organisms at a density that makes them effectively unkillable without specialized equipment. They move with a slow, deliberate wrongness that suggests something about their experience, something that the game never articulates directly. Are they aware? The Ganados are aware because the plaga control mechanism preserves cognitive function while overriding behavioral autonomy. The Regenerador transformation appears to go much further, but whether it destroys consciousness entirely or simply modifies it beyond recognition is never established. The people inside the Regeneradors, whatever is left of them, have never been given voice in any part of the franchise. The specific plaga variant used to create Regeneradors, and the methodology Los Illuminados developed to produce them, represents a distinct research direction that has never been traced. Whoever within the organization developed this technique, whatever documentation they produced in doing so, whether any of that knowledge survived the events of the game in any form, are questions the game raises implicitly without intending to answer them. Mystery 28. How liquor evolution works over time. Liquors evolve from T-virus zombies through a secondary mutation process that the franchise has never fully explained. The environmental or biological conditions that trigger this secondary development are described only vaguely, as a kind of progressive mutation that occurs in some infected individuals and not others. By the time of Resident Evil 6, liquor betas appear to represent a more developed variant, suggesting that the liquor mutation line has continued evolving across the 15 years between the Raccoon City incident and the game's events. If the liquor represents a stable mutation type, a secondary development that zombies undergo under specific conditions to produce a more dangerous organism, then the T-virus has a functional second stage in its infection cycle. Not all infected humans take this path, but those who do produce something significantly more capable than the base zombie form. The question of what drives the selection, what makes some infected individuals develop into lickers while others remain in the zombie state, has never been answered. And if the mutation line continues developing over time, If liquor betas represent a generation of further evolution from the original type, what does a liquor population look like after 50 years of self-contained development? What does the liquor line look like after a century? Mystery 29. The conscious state of the molded. The molded from Resident Evil 7 are the physical transformation that results when human beings are so thoroughly consumed by Evelyn's mold that they become extensions of her biological network. They move with purpose. They defend specific areas. They coordinate in ways that suggest communication rather than simple instinct. Village's revelations about the mold clarify that the fungal replacement process the Baker estate undergone preserves neural information in the mycelial tissue. The molded are composed of people in the specific sense that the mold that built them absorbed and retained the neural patterns of the humans they used to be. Whether those neural patterns constitute ongoing consciousness is never established. The distinction between active consciousness and archived information matters enormously here. Ethan Winters, after his death, was the mold running his archived patterns as an active process. The molded appear to be the mold running a much simplified version of that process, enough to animate and coordinate bodies, but not enough to maintain the full complexity of selfhood. But somewhere between full consciousness and empty automation, there may be a middle state, a partial awareness, a fragment of the original person experiencing the molded state from inside, without any capacity to influence or communicate it. The franchise has left this possibility standing open without addressing it. Part 6. The Operatives and What They Carry. Resident Evil's cast of intelligence operatives, military specialists, and organizational insiders is as interesting for what they conceal as for what they reveal. These are people whose professional lives are defined by information control, by the management of what is known and what is unknown, by expertise in maintaining ambiguity. Their mysteries are not accidental gaps, but are often the most deliberate elements of their characterization. Mystery 30. Ada Wong's true purpose. Ada's actions across 6 games constitute the most extensively documented ambiguous agenda in the franchise. She has collected G-virus material, Las Plagas samples, and various other viral agents across different missions. She has worked for Spencer's organization, for Wesker, for a figure whose identity is never established, and apparently for herself simultaneously. She has saved Leon Kennedy's life multiple times for reasons that are never fully explained by any organizational directive she has been given. The pattern of her collection across 20 years of franchise time suggests a cataloging function. She is building or maintaining a library of the most significant biological agents in existence, not developing them, not deploying them, collecting them, studying them, preserving them in the possession of a party that has never used them offensively. The only organizational profile consistent with this behavior is defensive, an entity interested in understanding every possible bioterrorism vector before it manifests as a crisis. The difference between Ada's organization and the BSAA, if this reading is correct, is that Ada's operates in complete secrecy with no political accountability and no operational constraints. They collect, they analyze, they do not announce themselves. They do not respond to crises publicly. They simply know what is out there. If this is what Ada has been building toward for 20 years, the knowledge her organization possesses about the state of global bioterrorism threats should be extraordinary, more comprehensive than any public organization's intelligence picture, more actionable than anything any government has, and all of it sitting in the hands of people who have never introduced themselves. Mystery 31. The family's long operational history. The family from Resident Evil 6 is a centuries-old organization of global power brokers. Their mandate is stability, which they pursue through the manipulation of political systems, the management of information flows, and the quiet application of financial and institutional pressure to maintain the configuration of global power that they have determined to be desirable. Derek Simmons is one of their senior members. His individual psychology twisted their institutional resources toward personal ends in a way that represented a betrayal of what they were supposed to be doing. But the family itself, the organization beyond Simmons, has never been shown. Their centuries of operation mean their fingerprints are on countless historical events in the Resident Evil world. The political responses to Raccoon City, the legal and regulatory frameworks around bioterrorism that emerged from that incident, the the specific way governments chose to manage Umbrella's collapse rather than pursuing criminal accountability through public channels, all of these outcomes could reflect the family's intervention. How deeply embedded is the family in the institutions that are supposed to be fighting bioterrorism? Are there family members inside the BSAA? Inside the BSAA's current leadership? Is the specific corruption that Chris discovers at the end of Village connected to family members who decided that BioW soldiers were a useful tool for managing stability rather than a threat to it? The family as an institution provides an explanatory framework for almost every piece of institutional corruption in the franchise, and the games have never explicitly activated that framework. Mystery 32. What Hunk did after 2003. After Umbrella's fall, Hunk created the CQBZ fighting style and became a legendary mercenary. That is the complete accounting of his post-2003 activities available from the franchise. A legendary mercenary operating in the bioterrorism landscape would be extraordinarily sought after by every organization with a need for elite field operators. He would have been approached by Tricell, the Connections, the BSAA, Blue Umbrella, national government intelligence agencies, and various private military contractors. Who did he work for? What missions did he take? The bioterrorism events documented in the franchise between 2003 and the present in and all required field operators of various kinds. It is not difficult to imagine Hunk's involvement in any of them. The specific incident in Harvardville that forms the backdrop of the Degeneration film involved the kind of operation Hunk would be well suited for. The events in Eastern Slav from Damnation required exactly the kind of specialist knowledge he possesses. His absence from credited involvement in any documented incident is itself a data point. Either he has been working off the record, taking assignments that no organization acknowledges publicly, or he has been working inside an organization whose activities are classified at a level that excludes the franchise's documented history. Either way, the story of Hunk's career from 2003 to the present is blank in a way that does not feel like oversight. Mystery 33. Krauser's specific mission with Leon. Jack Krauser tells Leon directly that they work together. He is precise about this in ways that make it clear the shared experience is not simply institutional acquaintance, but something more personally defining. The specific mission that formed their relationship, the one that apparently ended with Krauser faking his death and walking away from everything, is described in broad strokes but never shown in any detail across any part of the franchise. What happened on that mission? Darkside Chronicles provides some additional context around Krauser's developing disillusionment with institutional constraints and his physical injury that U.S. Special Forces would not support him through. But the specific events that turned him from a capable and committed operative into someone willing to abandon his entire former life remain sketched rather than drawn. Understanding that mission matters because it would explain Leon, not just Krauser. Leon's specific emotional response to encountering Krauser in Spain, the tension between professional opposition and something that reads like genuine grief, the way he processes what Krauser represents, all of that is colored by whatever they experience together. The event is the shadow that shapes both of them, and the franchise has never chosen to illuminate it directly. Mystery 34. The purpose Ada's employer has for viral samples. Ada's employer has been accumulating biological agents for longer than most organizations in the franchise have existed. They have G-virus material. They likely have Las Plagas derivatives. They have whatever Ada recovered from the Queen Zenobia incident and from her various other operations across the series. They have been receiving deliveries of the most dangerous pathogens in the world for 2 decades without anyone identifying them or disrupting their activities, and they have never deployed anything. Not once in the franchise timeline has an incident been traced back to Ada's employer. They are not manufacturing BOWs. They are not running test programs. They are not selling samples on the black market. They collect and they keep. The only framework that explains this behavior is that they are building insurance against a catastrophe they see coming. If you believe that bioterrorism is an escalating threat, if you believe that within your operational lifetime, a pathogen is going to be released at a scale that ends civilization, the rational preparation is to understand every possible agent before it appears in the field. The organization that has the most complete knowledge of what exists can respond most effectively when something is released that everyone else encounters for the first time. This is an explicitly defensive mission. But it means that somewhere in the world, there is an archive of almost every significant pathogen in the franchise's history, held by a party that operates with no accountability to any government or institution. What happens to that archive if Ada's employer is ever compromised? What happens to it if they die without passing access on? The most comprehensive bioweapon library in existence, held by the most secretive organization in a secretive world, is a liability as well as an asset. Mystery 35. Sergei's upload and what Wesker found. When Wesker killed Sergei Vladimir and recovered the UMF-013, he gained access to Umbrella's complete institutional archive. The games tell us he found Project W files. They tell us he found the Spencer estate data. What they do not tell us is what else was there. And Umbrella's archive accumulated 35 years of classified research across dozens of facilities. What specifically was in those files that has not been mentioned? Were there research programs that Umbrella ran and then abandoned, whose results were classified even from most of the company, that Wesker found when he went through the archive? Were there operations the company conducted that do not appear in any of the franchise's documented incidents? Things that happened in other countries? Other outbreaks that were contained before they became visible? Other biological events that Umbrella caused and then managed into silence? Wesker died in 2009. Whatever he found in those files either influenced his subsequent plans in ways the games depicted without explaining, or was stored somewhere that survived his death in Kilauea. A complete copy of Umbrella's institutional archive, including its most classified research, is one of those objects in the franchise's world that should have a documented chain of custody and does not. It simply disappears from the narrative when Wesker dies. Part 7. Consciousness, Identity, and What Survives Death. As Resident Evil has matured across 30 years, it has developed a recurring preoccupation with the question of what a person actually is when the biological substrate that normally houses their awareness is compromised, replaced, or transformed. These are not incidental themes. They emerge from specific plot points and have specific unresolved implications for multiple characters whose stories are ongoing. Mystery 36. Can Ethan Winters be recovered? The end of Resident Evil Village is, depending on how you read it, either a tragedy or a beginning. Ethan disperses himself into the Megamycete before triggering the explosion. His physical body does not survive. The Megamycete, or most of it, does not survive. The question of whether his consciousness, stored in that network at the moment of detonation, was entirely destroyed or merely scattered depends on whether any fragment of the Megamycete network survived the explosion in a state capable of maintaining stored information. Shadows of Rose establishes that the BSAA salvaged a fragment. Rose enters that fragment's realm and finds her father, not a memory, a presence with awareness and intent. Something that identifies as Ethan is in there, demonstrating the same qualities of consciousness that the Megamycete's preservation function produces in every archived mind. Miranda spent a century developing the methodology for extracting stored consciousness from the Megamycete and introducing it into a compatible living host. Her theoretical framework was correct, as Village demonstrates. The specific technique she developed was sound. What prevented her from completing it was Ethan's interference, not a flaw in the underlying science. The framework for recovering Ethan from the Megamycete fragment exists. A compatible host of sufficient mold composition exists in Rose, though using her would repeat the exact violation Ethan died to prevent. Other options might exist. Artificial hosts, engineered mold structures, configurations that Miranda's century of failure was moving toward before she settled on Rose as her solution. None of these options are explored in any game, but they are implied by everything the franchise has established about how consciousness and fungal tissue interact. Mystery 37. Who is Natalia Corda now? Revelations 2 ends with the good ending showing Natalia surrounded by newspaper coverage of recent events, reading Franz Kafka. She smiles with an expression that belongs to someone other than the girl who spent those months on Sign Island. The specific smile and the specific choice of reading material both of which are deeply associated with Alex Wesker's identity rather than Natalia's, constitute one of the most sustained pieces of visual ambiguity in the franchise's history. Alex's consciousness was successfully transferred into Natalia's body. The good ending proposes that Natalia's original self maintained dominance through the events of the game, and that Alex was suppressed rather than activated. The smile suggests suppression rather than elimination. Alex is in there. She is present. The specific expression on Natalia's face is hers. What is the current experience of living with a suppressed secondary consciousness? Is it like having a persistent intrusive thought that carries the full emotional weight of a different person's entire personality? Is it like having a very specific kind of split personality, one half of which is a brilliant, ruthless scientist obsessed with immortality and godhood? Is Alex patient, or is she struggling? Is she actively working to reassert control, accumulating influence slowly the way a virus accumulates in a host, waiting for the right moment of stress or weakness to take over completely? Natalia grew up in Barry Burton's family in Canada. She is an adult now in the franchise's current timeline. If Alex Wesker is still inside her, that version of Alex has watched and experienced Natalia's entire life since the island. She has had years to understand Natalia's psychology, her relationships, her vulnerabilities. If Alex is patient and calculating, she may have spent those years studying the one person she needs to understand completely in order to displace her permanently. Mystery 38. The G-Virus's agenda inside Sherry Birkin adapted to the G-Virus as a child, and the adaptation gave her the regenerative capabilities she carries into adulthood. But the G-Virus in its natural developmental state does not produce clean, stable enhancements. It produces continuous mutation and a drive toward propagation through embryo implantation. These properties define the Birkin creature's entire arc in Resident Evil 2. Sherry exhibits neither of them. She heals quickly and otherwise appears normal. The question of why the G-Virus produced a different outcome in Sherry than in her father has never been answered. Some of it is probably developmental timing. A child's immune system in active growth, encountering a viral agent before it fully establishes itself, might produce a different integration outcome than an adult who deliberately injects themselves with a pure sample. Some of it might be Sherry's own specific genetics. Some of it might be dosage related. But the G-Virus is still present in her body. It has been there for over 20 years of the franchise timeline. It has had 2 decades to adapt to its host, to develop in the specific biological environment that Sherry's physiology constitutes. The version of the G-Virus operating inside Sherry in 2013 is not the same version that entered her body in 1998. Viruses adapt to their hosts over time. What the G-Virus looks like in Sherry, after 2 decades of co-development with a human immune system that it has influenced and that has influenced it in return, is something no game has examined. Mystery 39. The social implications of progenitor humans. Wesker represents one data point for what a progenitor human is like in the modern world. A genius-level intellect with complete arrogance about his capabilities, driven by a vision of humanity's future that required most of humanity to die. This is not a representative sample from which to generalize. The ancient Ndapaya warrior kings who adapted naturally represent a different data point. They built a sophisticated civilization, maintained social roles within a functioning community, used their enhanced capabilities in service of collective advancement. Their adaptation produced contribution rather than predatory dominance. The difference between these two outcomes is entirely about context, values, and social structure rather than biology. Wesker's adaptation occurred within a framework that had been grooming him toward grandiosity and isolation for his entire life, through Project W's conditioning and through Umbrella's institutional culture. The Ndapaya kings adapted within a community that gave their capabilities social purpose and social accountability. A world in which progenitor human adaptation occurs naturally in the current population, without Umbrella's deliberate engineering, would produce individuals who adapted within their existing social contexts. A naturally compatible farmer in the Midwest would adapt differently than a naturally compatible intelligence analyst in Seoul. Their capabilities would be the same. Their relationship to those capabilities would be shaped by everything that made them who they were before the adaptation. The question of what progenitor humanity looks like at a population level, distributed across the full range of human contexts and value systems, is one the franchise has consistently raised through individual examples without ever examining its scale. Mystery 40. What Rose's path actually looks like. Rose Winters is currently the most biologically significant human being alive in the franchise's timeline, and also one of its most emotionally compelling figures. She grew up knowing her father died twice for her. She grew up carrying capabilities that isolated her. She grew up as a ward of government programs that saw her as a research asset before they saw her as a person. And she grew up with the knowledge, demonstrated in Shadows of Rose, that her father's consciousness is preserved in a fungal fragment in government custody, that he is not entirely gone, and that there is a theoretical mechanism by which he could be recovered into a living form if someone wanted to pursue it. The shadow of Miranda's methodology hangs over Rose's existence in a way the franchise has not yet addressed directly. Miranda spent a century searching for a vessel compatible enough to host Eva's consciousness. Rose is the most mold-compatible human being in the franchise's documented history. She is also in possession of the knowledge that her father's consciousness is preserved in exactly the kind of biological archive that Miranda's entire methodology was designed to extract from. Does Rose think about this? The possibility of bringing her father back, using the methodology that Miranda developed, using herself as the vessel that would overwrite her own consciousness with his? The franchise has positioned Rose as someone actively working through what it means to be who she is. The specific question of whether she has ever considered her own role in potentially recovering Ethan from the megamycete fragment is one that seems almost unavoidable for anyone in her position, and yet it has never been addressed in any game. Part 8. Organizations operating in darkness. The franchise's institutional horror is not limited to the organizations it has named and followed in detail. The Resident Evil world is populated with groups whose activities are partially visible through their effects on documented events, whose goals can be partially inferred from what they have been seen to do, and whose full nature remains deliberately obscure. These are the organizations that make the world of the franchise feel larger than any individual game's scope. Mystery 41. The Connections' complete product line. The Connections created Eveline. They used Miranda's mold samples as biological source material. They engineered a weapon system disguised as a child, with neurological control capabilities that represented a fundamentally different approach to bioweapon design than anything Umbrella had pursued. Instead of direct physical threats, Eveline created psychological compliance through parasitic infection that felt to its victims like love. This is an extraordinary innovation in weapons design. The organizational culture that produced it, that was capable of imagining this approach, developing it to the point of field deployment, and managing the moral and operational complexity of creating a conscious, child-shaped organism as a weapons platform, was thinking about bioweapons in ways that Umbrella's researchers never fully explored. What else were they thinking about? Eveline was their deployed product, but deployed products represent the end of development cycles. Everything that came before Eveline, all the research that produced her, was building on foundations that the organization presumably had before they identified the mold as a suitable base organism. What were those foundations? What other organisms did they try before settling on Miranda's mold? What did their failed prototypes look like? And what research was running in parallel with Eveline that was intended to produce a different kind of weapon system? Mystery 42. The BSAA's infected soldiers and who authorized them. The village post-credits scene is one of the franchise's most significant recent revelations. Chris Redfield discovers that the BSAA soldiers deployed in response to the village bioterrorism incident and are not human. They are biological weapons shaped like soldiers. They are BOWs in BSAA uniforms, deployed by the organization, whose entire reason for existing is preventing exactly this kind of development. This is not a small institutional error. This is not an individual going rogue. Deploying BOWs as operational soldiers requires a supply chain, a manufacturing program, a command structure that authorizes their use, a political decision at a significant level of organizational hierarchy to proceed with this approach, despite its obvious catastrophic implications, if discovered. Multiple people in positions of authority within the BSAA made active decisions to do this. Who are they? What is their justification? Is the BSAA's BOW soldier program the result of the same kind of ends justify the means institutional reasoning that has driven every bioterrorism organization in the franchise's history? Is it an infiltration by the family or some other external organization with the resources to compromise BSAA leadership? Is it a faction that believes bioweapon soldiers are simply more effective than human ones and has decided that the ethical problem is outweighed by the operational advantage? Resident Evil Requiem's storyline is clearly engaging with the continued consequences of what Chris discovered at the end of Village, but the full institutional accounting for who made those decisions and what their complete reasoning was has not been provided. Mystery 43. TerraSave's knowledge and vulnerability. Claire Redfield has worked for TerraSave for most of her adult life in the franchise timeline. TerraSave sends people to post-incident sites, to communities affected by bioterrorism events, to the places where survivors try to understand what happened to them. They collect testimony from people that formal investigations never interview. They see the human consequences of incidents that government agencies treat primarily as security matters. This means TerraSave has, over the years of its operation, accumulated a picture of the global bioterrorism landscape that is uniquely human in its perspective. Not intelligence about viral strains or organizational structures, but knowledge about how these incidents actually affect communities. What patterns of harm recur? What warning signs appear before escalation? Who the vulnerable populations are before they become victim populations? That picture is extraordinarily valuable to anyone who wants to understand the bioterrorism threat at a systemic level. It is also the kind of knowledge that the organizations responsible for those threats would want to suppress. The fact that TerraSave was specifically targeted by Alex Wesker, that its senior members were used as test subjects, is consistent with an organization that has information someone finds threatening. Neil Fisher's betrayal from within TerraSave represents exactly the kind of institutional vulnerability that comes with being genuinely effective at gathering sensitive information. How much does TerraSave know that it does not know it knows? How many of its collected testimonies, assembled without full understanding of the context they came from, contain pieces of information that would be significant to someone with a broader picture of what was happening? TerraSave's archive is an inadvertent intelligence database that no one has ever fully analyzed. Mystery 44. Where Umbrella's archive went after Wesker died in the caldera of a volcano in 2009, with a rocket launcher aimed at him and a lethal dose of PG67A/W in his bloodstream. He was definitively killed. Whatever he personally carried died with him. But Wesker was not the kind of strategic thinker who maintained a single copy of his most valuable assets. He had been planning global transformation for years. He had research infrastructure, organizational connections, financial systems. None of these died with him cleanly. Organizations with his level of operational sophistication maintain continuity plans. They distribute access. They ensure that the most critical information cannot be destroyed by the death of any single individual. Whatever copy Wesker made of the UMF-013 was stored somewhere that he considered secure. That somewhere still exists. The complete institutional archive of Umbrella Corporation, including its most classified research from 35 years of global operations, is in a location that the franchise has not identified. Whoever finds it, whoever currently has access to it, whatever they have done with what is inside it, is one of the franchise's great open questions, precisely because the archive's existence is confirmed and its location is not. Mystery 45. The true scope of the family's interference. Derek Simmons as an individual represents one member's specific psychopathology, distorting the family's institutional agenda. But the family as an institution has been operating for centuries, shaping global events according to their own conception of what stability requires. Their influence extends to intelligence organizations, to political systems, to financial markets, to the kind of institutional infrastructure that never appears in history books but shapes everything that does. The specific interventions the family has made in the events of the Resident Evil franchise, the ones that happened off-screen, the quiet hands on quiet levers that produced outcomes the games depicted without explaining, form a shadow history running parallel to the franchise's documented narrative. The speed with which certain bioterrorism incidents were classified and contained, rather than publicly acknowledged. The specific way Umbrella's legal dissolution proceeded. The particular configuration of international response to the various crises that make up the franchise's timeline. All of these could bear the family's fingerprints. None of them have been explicitly connected. The organization exists in the franchise as a demonstrated capability without a demonstrated history, and the history implied by that capability, the actual record of what they have done across centuries of operation, is one of the largest unexplored spaces in the franchise's lore. Part 9. The specific loose ends. Some mysteries are interesting theoretical questions. These are different. These are specific, concrete, documentable gaps in the franchise's narrative, places where something was clearly set up and clearly not followed through on, or places where what is described has implications so significant that the franchise's silence about them feels almost louder than anything it has said. Mystery 46. The post-credits vial, the 2020 Resident Evil 3 remake, closes with a scene that has been analyzed more intensely than almost any moment in the franchise's recent history. A figure in green enters a room. They find a broken vial on a desk. They examine it. The game ends. If this scene were simply about showing the aftermath of events, it would not need to be there. The game's ending is complete without it. The decision to include a post-credits scene, to show this specific detail, to frame it as a discrete event with a beginning and a middle, but deliberately no end, is a production choice. It is the kind of choice that games make when they are establishing future narrative. The broken vial was on a desk. Desks in Resident Evil are where researchers leave things, where important objects are placed with intent. The breaking of the vial is either accidental, the result of the chaos that destroyed Raccoon City, or deliberate, someone breaking it to destroy or release its contents before they left. Both readings are interesting. Both readings change what the figure in green is doing when they pick it up. If the contents were destroyed, and this is cleanup, the figure is documenting what was there. If the contents were released and this is investigation, the figure is trying to understand what was exposed. If the breaking was accidental, and this is recovery, the figure is trying to assess what survived. 3 completely different mission profiles, 3 completely different implications for what they are going to do next. The franchise has not indicated which reading is correct. Mystery 47. What the BSAA understands about the Megamycete. The BSAA secured a fragment of the Megamycete after the village incident. This is established in Shadows of Rose. The fragment is large enough for Rose to physically enter its realm, which means it is large enough to maintain the Megamycete's consciousness storage function in at least a partial form. The BSAA has this in their possession. Do they know what they have? The consciousness storage function of the Megamycete is not documented in any publicly available scientific literature. Miranda's research, which contains the full theoretical framework for understanding it, may or may not have been recovered during the village incident's cleanup. If the BSAA researchers studying the fragment do not have Miranda's documentation as a reference, they are encountering properties that have no precedent in any field of biology they have ever worked in. They would be conducting experiments that produce completely inexplicable results, with no framework for understanding why a piece of fungal tissue seems to respond to cognitive engagement, why it produces experiences in researchers who interact closely with it, why it behaves as if there is something inside it that is aware. If they do have Miranda's documentation, they understand exactly what they are holding. A fragment of the most sophisticated consciousness preservation organism ever documented, containing an archive of human experience going back potentially thousands of years, including at minimum the awareness of Ethan Winters. The ethical implications of what you do with that fragment, who has access to it, what you are allowed to do in attempting to study or interact with the consciousnesses preserved within it, would constitute an entirely new field of research without any existing ethical framework to guide it. Mystery 48. Rose and the figure who found her, Shadows of Rose, ends with Rose and her government handler in what should be a secure location when a figure approaches them. The figure has found her despite her protection. They know where she is. They have the capability to reach her. Who has those capabilities? The government program protecting Rose would classify her location as sensitive intelligence. Finding her requires either compromising that classification or working from inside the protection apparatus. Neither is easy. Both point toward a party with significant resources and significant institutional access. The timing of the approach, coming at the end of Rose's DLC after she has apparently stabilized her relationship with her mold abilities, is presumably not coincidental. Whoever this figure is, they were waiting for her to reach a specific state before making contact. They monitored her development. They knew when to approach. This implies long observation rather than recent targeting. The two most interesting possibilities are an approach from whatever organization Ada Wong ultimately represents, an entity with decades of interest in exactly the kind of biological capability Rose embodies, or a connection to whatever is coming in the franchise's next major installment. The figure's identity has been confirmed by no official source as of this writing. The approach may represent help, threat, or something more complicated than either. Every remaining Resident Evil mystery exists in that space of complicated. Mystery 49, Resident Evil Requiem's Open Ends. The most recent game in the franchise, Resident Evil Requiem, released in February 2026, brought back Leon Kennedy alongside a new protagonist in Grace Ashcroft as they return to Raccoon City. The game established that both Leon and Sherry Birkin are dealing with active T-virus presence in their bodies, a revelation that changes the status of two of the franchise's longest-serving characters. The specific nature of that infection, how long it has been active, whether it is the result of their original exposures in 1998 or something more recent, has not been fully explained. The game's end left Chris Redfield's whereabouts unaccounted for, mentioned by other characters but never shown, which in a franchise that has featured Chris Redfield in nearly every major entry since 1996 is a conspicuous absence. The specific mission Chris is on that took him away from the events depicted in Requiem is either irrelevant to the main story in a way the narrative team decided to leave off-screen, or it is something significant enough to constitute its own storyline that is being developed for future content. The unnamed soldiers who appeared at the game's end, whose affiliation is unclear, who killed BSAA agents and took something from them, are a brand new mystery deposited at the franchise's current storyline for future development. What they took, why they killed for it specifically, who deployed them. All of this is the franchise's freshest open wound. Mystery 50. What the Duke actually is. The Duke exists in Resident Evil Village as the most effective sustained mystery in the franchise's recent history. He is physically enormous. He appears in locations that are physically inaccessible. He knows things about the history of the village, about Miranda's research, about Ethan's situation, that no outside observer could possess. He has a personal relationship with Miranda that spans decades. He references the Resident Evil 4 merchant as an old friend. His shop interface carries the name Lady Carolyn Margaret Devine, a name that appears nowhere in any Resident Evil property for or after Village. And when Ethan asks him directly what he is, he admits he does not know. That last detail is the most important one. The Duke's mystery is not one he is choosing to maintain. He is not being strategically opaque about his nature. He is genuinely uncertain about what he is, how he does what he does, why the normal rules do not seem to apply to him. He can do things he cannot explain. He exists in ways he cannot account for. His self-knowledge has limits that his capabilities do not share. The connection to the merchant from Resident Evil 4 is the most significant piece of information the game provides about the Duke's nature. Not a reference, not a quote, a personal relationship. The merchant from RE4 appeared in physically impossible locations. He was unharmed by attacks. He had knowledge of Los Iluminados and Las Plagas that exceeded what any outside observer should have had. He sold specialized equipment to Leon Kennedy in the middle of a bioterrorism incident with the calm professionalism of someone who was simply doing what he was there to do. His character was treated as a gameplay mechanic for the better part of the game's development history. But if the Duke claims him as an old friend, the merchant was a person, a specific individual with a specific relationship to this Duke, a shared history, a connection that implies a category. If the Duke and the merchant represent the same kind of being rather than the same individual, if they are two examples of a category that the franchise has not yet named, then the question of what that category is becomes one of the most interesting structural questions in the entire franchise. What are the conditions that produce something like the Duke? Is it biological in origin, some form of adaptation to the specific kind of viral environment that bioterrorism incidents create? Is it connected to the same ancient forces that produce the progenitor virus and the megamycete? Is it something stranger, something the franchise's biological framework cannot fully contain? The Duke does not know. He admits this openly, without defensiveness, with a quality that reads as genuine reflection rather than evasion. He has had a very long time to think about what he is. He has arrived at the conclusion that he cannot answer the question. And that honest uncertainty is more unsettling than any deliberate mystery the franchise has ever constructed, because it suggests that whatever the Duke represents exists outside the categories that even a being of his knowledge and capability can make sense of. Whatever he is, he was there when Ethan needed him. He helped in ways that made the difference. He grieved after his fashion when Ethan was gone. Whatever the Duke's nature turns out to be when the franchise finally chooses to address it, it will connect to something much older than Miranda's village, and much larger than any individual story the games have told so far. That is where these 50 mysteries leave us. Not at the end of questions, but at the edge of what the questions are pointing toward. Somewhere in the combined weight of all these unresolved threads, in the accumulated silence of everything the franchise has declined to explain, there is the shape of a story that has not yet been told. The oldest virus on Earth, the fungal archive beneath the mountains, the organizations that collect pathogens they never deploy, the beings that appear in the places where horror happens and do not seem to belong to any of the categories the horror creates, the children living with consciousnesses that are not entirely their own. These things are connected in ways the franchise keeps suggesting and keeps refusing to articulate. That suggestion, that sense of something larger behind everything you have been told, is what brings people back to this franchise after 30 years. The monsters have changed. The protagonists have changed. The viruses have mutated through enough variants to require a dedicated wiki just to keep track of them. But the feeling that you are only seeing part of the picture, that the full story is something just slightly beyond what you have been shown, has been constant from the first moment you found a memo on a blood-stained desk and understood that whoever left it knew something you still did not. That feeling has never gone away. These 50 questions are proof of it. If you made it this far, I hope it felt worth the time. If you found yourself pausing to think about one of these, if you found yourself wanting to argue with something or extend an idea further than I took it, that is exactly what this was for. Drop the mystery that frustrates you most in the comments. Tell me which one you think Capcom is most likely to answer in the next game. Tell me the one that you think might never be answered and why that does not bother you. If this kind of deep, unhurried lore exploration is what brings you back here, a like and a subscribe costs you nothing and means I can keep making these. There are plenty more threads to pull on. There are always more threads. Sleep well. And if something in those 50 mysteries follows you into the dark tonight, just remember that the Duke would say he does not know what he is either, which, honestly, makes two of you. Until next time. Extended reflections, going deeper on the mysteries that deserve it. Some of the questions raised above need more room than a single entry can provide. The franchise has been accumulating these threads for so long that the full weight of what they imply requires more than a brief examination. This section revisits the most significant mysteries with the attention they deserve. The progenitor virus, a deeper look at what cannot be explained when you spend enough time with the progenitor. Virus's documented properties, you arrive at something that the franchise's own in-game scientists describe as impossible, not difficult, not unprecedented. Impossible within the framework of how biology actually works. A virus requires a host cell to reproduce. This is fundamental to what a virus is. It is not an independent organism. It is a strand of genetic material wrapped in a protein coat that hijacks the cellular machinery of a living cell to make copies of itself. The specificity of that hijacking is what limits any real-world virus to a narrow range of hosts. The HIV virus requires specific cellular receptors found only in certain human immune cells. Influenza requires specific surface proteins found in respiratory epithelial cells. The more specific the lock and key relationship between virus and receptor, the narrower the range of compatible hosts. Progenitor infects any organism. The Sonentrepe flowers that produce it are not animals. They are plants. The virus that lives inside them also infects mammals, insects, fish, fungi, and bacteria. This is not a minor stretch of plausibility. This violates the fundamental mechanism of how viruses work at the cellular level. A single viral particle cannot carry the key for every possible lock in every possible kingdom of life. The protein configuration required to infect a plant cell is chemically incompatible with the configuration required to infect a human neuron. The franchise's lore resolves this by suggesting that Progenitor is not a conventional virus, that it represents something at the level of foundational biology, a form of genetic mechanism so ancient and so fundamental that it predates the divergence of the kingdoms of life from their common ancestor. If Progenitor was present before plants and animals had diverged into separate evolutionary lineages, it would have been present before the cellular locks it needs to pick had differentiated. It would carry, in some sense, the master key for a system it helped build. This is what the in-game research is gesturing toward when it describes Progenitor as a potential building block of life itself. And if that is true, if this virus is genuinely a foundational component of Earth's biology, then the question of its origin goes beyond the scientific. The specific mechanism by which life began on this planet is one of science's most profound open questions. The Resident Evil franchise has quietly embedded that question inside the origin of its central pathogen and then never followed it to its conclusion. What was Progenitor before there were organisms capable of hosting it? What was the Sun Garden before there were organisms capable of being affected by it? If the cave in West Africa is genuinely the location where something fundamental to life on Earth originated, what are the implications of Umbrella having built a research facility on top of it? What are the implications of Tricell using that location to develop Ouroboros? What are the implications of the BSAA discovering it and apparently securing it in 2009 without any subsequent mention of what they found there? The franchise opened a door here that it has never walked through. The door remains open. The Umbrella training facility and what Marcus really did. James Marcus is documented as having conducted illegal experiments on trainees at the Umbrella Executive Training Facility. This is what gave Wesker and Birkin the evidence to help Spencer remove him from power in 1978. The specific nature of those illegal experiments has been described in broad terms. He was studying the T-virus's effects on human subjects without proper authorization and without the subject's knowledge or consent. But Marcus was the T-virus's creator. The specific direction of his research at the training facility was aimed at something more specific than simply testing the virus's effects. He was pursuing the question of how an organism, specifically the leech population he was working most closely with, could be used to stabilize viral infection in human hosts. The theoretical question driving his illegal experiments was probably something like this. Could the T-virus be modified through its interaction with leech biology into something that produced consistent, reliable enhancement in human subjects rather than the chaotic mutation that defined its effects in standard infection scenarios? If that is the right reading of what Marcus was trying to do, his goal was not to create weapons. His goal was to solve Progenitor's fundamental problem. The virus kills almost everyone who encounters it. Surviving the infection and gaining its benefits requires a biological configuration so rare that it cannot be reliably produced. Marcus was trying to use leech biology as a catalyst to reduce that fatality rate. He wanted to create an accessible version of what progenitor humans achieved naturally. He failed in the conventional sense. The leech experiments produced the T-virus, which turned out to be an extraordinarily effective weapon, but a terrible solution to the human enhancement question because it killed or degraded its hosts rather than enhancing them. But Marcus's research direction, the question of how to make progenitor's benefits accessible without its lethality, is actually the most important question anyone in the franchise ever tried to answer. Spencer was pursuing the same goal through selective breeding with Project W. Alex Wesker was pursuing it through consciousness transfer. Miranda was pursuing it through fungal biology. Everyone was trying to solve the same problem from different angles. None of them got there. And the question of whether it is actually solvable, whether there is a mechanism that reliably produces progenitor adaptation without the 99% lethality, has never been answered. William Birkin's work. Before Raccoon City, William Birkin is remembered primarily as the G-creature he became in 1998, the monster that his own colleagues shot and left to die in a sewer, who dragged himself to a viral sample and transformed into something unprecedented. But Birkin was a scientist before he was a monster, and his scientific work across 2 decades inside Umbrella represents a significant chapter of the franchise's history that receives relatively little attention compared to the dramatic events of his death. Birkin discovered the G-virus in 1988 inside Lisa Trevor's body. The discovery itself required him to recognize what he was looking at, a new viral organism that had never been documented, emerging from the unique biological environment that Lisa's decades of overlapping infection had created. No other researcher in any of Umbrella's facilities had produced anything comparable. The G-virus is not a modification of progenitor or T-virus or any other existing agent. It is something that emerged from Lisa's specific biology, an evolutionary development that could not have been engineered deliberately because no one would have known what to aim for. How did Birkin recognize what he had found? He had been studying viral biology for years, but nothing in his previous experience would have prepared him to identify the G-virus as a distinct organism rather than simply another mutation product. The specific intellectual process by which he went from observing an unusual result in Lisa Trevor's biology to understanding that he was looking at a new viral organism, the specific moment of recognition that whatever this was had never been seen before, is one of the franchise's most significant undocumented scientific moments. And what else did Birkin discover in 20 years of research that never made it into any game's documentation? He was one of Umbrella's most brilliant researchers, working at the cutting edge of viral biology for 2 decades. The G-virus was his most significant breakthrough, but 20 years of a brilliant scientist's work produces many findings. What else did he see in his research that he documented, that went into the archives of the Arklay laboratory, that was presumably copied into the UMF-013 and therefore exists somewhere in the franchise's world, waiting to be recovered? The full history of Raccoon City's relationship with Umbrella. Raccoon City's complete history with Umbrella Corporation predates the 1998 outbreak by decades. Umbrella was the city's primary employer. It had facilities in the city and in the surrounding mountains. Its researchers lived in the community, went to the same churches and restaurants and schools as everyone else. The city's economic dependence on Umbrella was so complete that challenging the company politically or legally was essentially impossible for anyone whose livelihood depended on the local economy. This relationship, spanning decades before the outbreak, produced a specific kind of institutional rot that the franchise documents in its Raccoon City materials but never examines at full depth. The police department that was compromised because its chief accepted Umbrella funding. The city officials who knew something was wrong in the Arklay Mountains but said nothing because Umbrella was too economically central to challenge. The residents who noticed unusual things but had no framework for understanding what they were seeing and no institutional support for reporting it. The entire history of a city that was gradually being hollowed out by the institutional presence of a company that treated it as a research environment rather than a community of people is a story the franchise has outlined but never told in full. The specific mechanisms by which Umbrella maintained its control over Raccoon City's political and law enforcement infrastructure, the specific relationships between Umbrella employees and city officials across the decades before 1998, the specific ways in which ordinary residents tried to resist or expose what was happening and were silenced or ignored, all of this is backdrop in the games rather than foreground. The question of resistance. Communities that pushed back. Every major Resident Evil game presents a bioterrorism incident and a small group of individuals fighting to survive and contain it. The franchise almost never depicts what happens to the communities surrounding those incidents. The people who were not directly involved in the outbreak, who lived in adjacent areas, who heard rumors or saw unusual activity, who were eventually told something that may or may not have been the truth about what happened near them. What does it do to a community to be told that a pharmaceutical company's experimental accident killed everyone in the neighboring city? The people in the towns near Raccoon City knew something had happened. They could see the smoke. They could hear the reports. Whatever official story they were given about why an American city was bombed and the entire event was classified, They were living with an explanation that did not fully account for what they had witnessed from a distance. The franchise has occasionally touched on this, showing communities in subsequent games that are dealing with the aftermath of incidents without full information. But the systematic examination of how people outside the franchise's protagonists understand and process the world they are living in has never been the game's focus. There are communities all over the Resident Evil world that have been changed by events they do not fully understand. People who have developed their own theories about what happened to places they knew, about what the organizations operating near their communities were actually doing. The franchise's world has more unofficial historians than it has ever depicted. Alex Wesker's vision versus Spencer's vision. Spencer wanted to be worshipped as the father of a new human race. Alex Wesker wanted to become that new human race in a single individual, to transcend her dying body by transferring her consciousness into a vessel that could house her indefinitely, to achieve literally personal immortality as a precondition for whatever she intended to do afterward. The two visions are similar in their narcissism and their use of other human beings as instrumental means to a self-centered end, but they differ in something important. Spencer's vision required the world to cooperate. He needed survivors of the Ouroboros release to actually form the new civilization he imagined himself ruling. He needed them to recognize his role in creating them, which required some form of communication and acknowledgement that they received from him rather than developed independently. His vision was externally validated. Alex's vision required nothing from anyone else. If she could transfer her consciousness into Natalia's body and maintain it there indefinitely, she would have achieved everything she wanted. She did not need recognition. She did not need other survivors. She needed one young girl to be a suitable vessel and for the process to work. The isolation of this goal, the way it reduces the entire enterprise of bioweapon research to a single personal survival project, is in some ways more disturbing than Spencer's grandiosity. Spencer was delusional about being a god. Alex was coldly rational about being a parasite. The question of what Alex would have done with immortality, assuming her consciousness transfer succeeded, has never been addressed because the franchise treated her as a contained villain rather than an ongoing threat. But a Wesker who could not be killed, who could simply hop from body to body when her current vessel aged or was damaged, who had the full knowledge base of everything Umbrella's research had produced, who had years or decades to develop relationships and institutional positions and the kind of long-term strategic capacity that mortal beings cannot maintain, would be a genuinely different kind of antagonist than anything the franchise has faced. The mold's own agenda. Miranda understood the Megamycete as a research subject and eventually as a tool. She studied it, cataloged its properties, developed methodologies for interacting with it, and ultimately planned to use it to resurrect her daughter. Her relationship with it was instrumental. She was the scientist, and it was the organism she was studying. But the Megamycete is not passive. It has been growing for thousands of years. It has been consuming and archiving organic matter across its entire lifespan. It has been creating functional biological copies of organisms through its infection and replacement mechanism. It has been doing all of this without anyone directing it to, driven by whatever biological imperatives govern a colonial fungal organism of this age and complexity. What does the Megamycete want? That question sounds ridiculous applied to a fungus, but the franchise has established that this fungus preserves consciousness, that it maintains the archived awareness of everyone it has ever consumed, that it can apparently communicate with Rose in Shadows of Rose in ways that suggest awareness on its part rather than simply passive information storage. If the Megamycete is aware, if the accumulated weight of every consciousness it has ever consumed has produced something like a distributed intelligence, then the question of what it wants becomes genuinely interesting. Is the Megamycete trying to expand? Is it working towards some biological goal that its activity serves? Miranda spent a century studying it and never asked this question because for Miranda the fungus was a means to an end, and its own agenda was irrelevant. But an organism that has been growing for potentially thousands of years, that has developed the capacity to interact with human consciousness, that has been archiving the accumulated experience of human generations in a specific mountain range, is doing something. That something may not be directed intelligence. It may be purely mechanical biology, fungal growth and consumption following its own ecological logic, but the franchise has never committed to that reading. The timeline of bioterrorism and what it reveals. Looking at the franchise's documented incidents chronologically, a pattern emerges that the games have never directly acknowledged. The initial incidents are isolated, localized, the result of specific accidents or deliberate deployments in contained areas. Raccoon City is the largest, but it is still a single city. The subsequent incidents are larger, more geographically distributed, more difficult to contain. By Resident Evil 6, a global deployment of the C virus is underway simultaneously in multiple countries on multiple continents. The escalation is not simply a narrative escalation for dramatic effect. It reflects something about how bioterrorism evolves when the knowledge required to create threats is distributed across multiple organizations, and when the institutional memory of how to handle them is constantly being lost through the destruction of the organizations that developed it. Umbrella built up expertise over decades. When it fell, that expertise scattered. The successor organizations each had fragments of it, and when they failed, the fragments scattered further. The knowledge of how to create specific threats became less centralized, while the knowledge of how to respond remained more dependent on centralized institutions, like the BSAA. This asymmetry between distributed offensive capability and centralized defensive capability is what drives the franchise's escalating threat level. And the question of how this asymmetry resolves, whether defensive capability can ever distribute to match offensive capability, or whether the eventual outcome is an incident large enough to overcome any centralized response, is one the franchise has been building toward for 30 years without ever directly stating it. The silence around this trajectory, the absence of any game that directly addresses where this escalation ends, is perhaps the most significant mystery of all, because it is the one that describes not what has happened, but what is still coming. The personal cost of survival. Every protagonist in Resident Evil carries permanent psychological and sometimes biological damage from what they have survived. Chris Redfield's long-term PTSD from decades of bioterrorism response is acknowledged in Resident Evil 6. Jill Valentine's experience of being used as Wesker's controlled subject for years, the specific horror of losing agency over your own body and actions, is documented in Resident Evil 5. Leon Kennedy's entire character arc across the franchise is a study in what competence built on unprocessed grief looks like, in a person who never stops moving long enough to deal with what is accumulating behind them. None of these characters have ever received, within the franchise's narrative, anything that resembles adequate psychological support or treatment. They survive. They are activated for the next crisis. They survive again. The franchise treats their psychological damage as background texture for their characterization, rather than as an ongoing process that demands attention. Jill Valentine has presumably been in some form of institutional support since Resident Evil 5. The games have not shown any of it. The question of what the long-term mental health consequences of repeated bioterrorism exposure look like for the individuals who have been on the front lines of every major incident since 1998 is one the franchise has gestured at without examining. Leon, at the end of Resident Evil 6, is visibly exhausted in ways that go beyond physical fatigue. Chris, in his introduction in Resident Evil 6, is portrayed as having essentially collapsed from the weight of accumulated loss. Both of them keep going anyway, because the franchise needs them to. But what they are carrying and what it is doing to them is a story the games keep implying and never fully tell. The next thing coming, Resident Evil Requiem, has deposited several new mysteries at the franchise's feet, while providing some resolution to ongoing threads. Leon and Sherry's viral status, the new protagonist Grace Ashcroft, and what her connection to the Ashford lineage means for where this goes next. The unidentified soldiers who took something from the BSAA at the game's end. The figure approaching Rose. The absence of Chris. All of these point in a similar direction. The franchise is building towards something that connects its oldest mysteries to its newest ones. The Ashford lineage and Grace, connecting back to one of Umbrella's founding families. The question of what the BSAA's BOW soldier program means for institutional accountability. The ongoing implications of Rose's biology and what she represents. The megamycete fragment in research custody. What that something is, what the accumulated weight of 30 years of franchise history is being aimed at, is the mystery that contains all the others. Not just the Duke, not just Ada's employer, not just the progenitor virus's cosmological origin, all of them. The specific story that the franchise has been telling with all of its component parts, the shape that emerges when every thread is pulled taut simultaneously. That story has not been told yet, but the telling feels closer now than it has at any point in the franchise's history. The pieces are on the board, the questions have accumulated to a density that demands resolution, and somewhere in the space between what has been shown and what has only been implied, the answer to 50 questions that have kept people thinking in the dark is still waiting to be found. The light is out. The air is still. And somewhere beneath the mountains, something ancient is still growing. The quiet details that change everything. There is a category of mystery in the Resident Evil franchise that is different from the big, unanswered questions about viral origins and organizational conspiracies. These are the quiet details, the small observations embedded in background files or environmental storytelling that carry enormous implications if you follow them through to their logical conclusions. They are easy to miss because they do not announce themselves. They sit in the margins of the main narrative and wait to be noticed. The last entries. Every Resident Evil game contains researchers' journals and diary entries that end abruptly. This is expected. The writers who create them know that the researcher died or was evacuated before finishing their documentation. The abrupt endings are intentional narrative choices that convey the chaos of outbreak events. But occasionally, the last entry in a particular journal does something more interesting than simply stopping. It raises a question in its final lines that the silence following it never answers. The diary of a researcher in the Arklay laboratory, found in the original Resident Evil game, ends with the writer describing the strange behavior of their dog. The final entry notes that the dog seems different, that something about its eyes has changed. The implication is that the writer has not yet understood that the T-virus has already begun spreading through the facility's water supply. The horror of that last entry is the gap between what the writer thinks they are observing and what they are actually witnessing. But the diary ends there. The writer presumably died in the subsequent days. What they did not write, the moment when they understood, when the confusion resolved into comprehension, when their own infection began, or when they saw what had happened to their colleagues, that story exists in the silence after the final entry. Every abandoned journal in the franchise carries this quality. The text is what was written. The story is everything that happened after the writing stopped. This is not a mystery in the conventional sense. No single missing diary tells us something critical about the franchise's lore. But collectively, these cut-off voices constitute a kind of testimony to the human experience of every outbreak. The people who were there and did not make it out. The ones whose perspective we get briefly and then lose. Their stories form the negative space around the protagonist's survival narratives, and the franchise has never tried to complete what they started telling. The umbrella buildings that are still standing, Raccoon City was destroyed in 1998 by a government-ordered missile strike. The city itself was eliminated, but Umbrella operated facilities in dozens of locations beyond Raccoon City. The Spencer mansion was destroyed in the explosion at the end of the original game. The Arklay laboratory beneath it was presumably destroyed in the same event. The Antarctic facility was destroyed by an explosion at the end of Code Veronica. The Africa laboratory's fate after the BSAA intervention in 2009 is unclear. But what about the other facilities, the European branches of Umbrella that are referenced but never shown? The regional laboratories that would have existed to support a global research and manufacturing operation of Umbrella's scale. The corporate offices that handled the legitimate pharmaceutical business that funded the weapons research. The warehouses and distribution facilities and transportation infrastructure that moved viral samples and biological weapons around the world. Some of these buildings still exist. Empty, presumably. Abandoned after Umbrella's collapse. Sitting in various cities and industrial zones across Europe, the Americas, and Asia, looking from the outside like any other former pharmaceutical company's facilities. Their interiors would contain residual evidence of what they were used for. Documents that were not properly destroyed, equipment that was not properly disposed of, traces of viral contamination in environmental surfaces that might or might not have remained active over the 2+ decades since the facilities were closed. Any organization with the resources and the knowledge of where to look could go into these buildings and recover material that Umbrella left behind. Some of them almost certainly already have. The scavenger economy that emerged from Umbrella's collapse, described briefly in various franchise entries as a thriving black market for former Umbrella technology and research, would have included people systematically working through former Umbrella facilities. What they found, what was still there to be found after 20 years, and what they did with it has never been documented. The children of Raccoon City had a large population before the 1998 outbreak. That population included a significant number of children attending school, living in neighborhoods, going about the ordinary life of a mid-sized American city. The canonical account of the outbreak is that nearly everyone in the city died, but nearly is doing a lot of work in that sentence when the actual population we are talking about is approximately 100,000 people. The fraction of survivors from Raccoon City who were children in 1998 is a question the franchise has never addressed. Children who were on school field trips outside the city on the day the outbreak began. Children who were evacuated early in the outbreak's progression when the scale of the crisis was not yet fully understood. Children who escaped through the determined effort of adults who did not make it out themselves. Children who simply survived by being in the right place or the wrong place in the right way. These children would now be adults in the franchise's current timeline. They would be somewhere in their mid-30s, carrying the memory of having watched their city destroyed, having lost parents or siblings or friends, having grown up with the knowledge that something the government classified and contained had killed everyone they knew. Some of them probably know more than the official story accounts for. Some of them have probably spent their entire adult lives trying to understand what happened and being denied information that they have more right to than almost anyone else. The franchise has an Ashford carrying the legacy of one of Umbrella's founding families into the current generation in Grace Ashcroft. It has Rose Winters carrying the biological legacy of Eveline and the mold forward. It has never given us a character who carries the specifically human legacy of surviving Raccoon City as a child. That character's perspective, that way of understanding what Umbrella was and what it did, would be different from every other perspective in the franchise, and has never been shown. The specific moment, Wesker decided Albert Wesker was conditioned by Project W from childhood to develop Spencer's values, to internalize Spencer's vision of human potential and human inadequacy. He was guided into Umbrella, guided toward the research that would eventually produce his transformation, guided toward becoming exactly what Spencer needed him to be. He did not know any of this was happening. He thought his ambitions were his own. The specific moment when Wesker's ambitions diverged from Spencer's, when the vision that Spencer had shaped him to serve was replaced by a vision that served Wesker himself, has never been shown. There is a moment somewhere in Wesker's history where he stopped being Spencer's asset and started being his own project. That moment required a specific kind of self-awareness. The recognition that he had been manipulated his entire life, combined with the decision to use what that manipulation had made him for his own purposes rather than his creators. That psychological turning point is one of the most interesting unexplored moments in the franchise's character history. Wesker, at the end of his story in Resident Evil 5, is fully formed as an independent antagonist with his own vision. But Wesker at some earlier point was still Spencer's instrument without knowing it. The journey between those two states, the gradual emergence of independent intention inside a consciousness that had been shaped from the outside, is the most human story in the franchise's most consistently inhuman villain. The question of institutional accountability, Umbrella Corporation was legally dissolved through criminal proceedings in 2003. The specific legal and criminal accountability that followed from that dissolution has never been fully described. We know the company no longer exists. We know its surviving leadership, the ones who were still alive, were presumably subject to some form of legal consequence. We know the U.S. government was involved in the prosecution, but the scale of Umbrella's crimes across 35 years of operation is extraordinary. The Raccoon City outbreak killed approximately 100,000 people. The contamination of the water supply, the deliberate deployment of biological weapons in test environments, the human experimentation programs, the suppression of evidence, the corruption of public officials, all of this would constitute the most significant criminal proceeding in human history if properly prosecuted. The specific outcomes of that prosecution, who was charged, who was convicted, what sentences were served, whether any justice was achieved at a scale proportionate to the harm caused, have never been depicted. The franchise treats Umbrella's legal end as a background fact, without examining what that ending actually meant for the people who were harmed. The survivors of Raccoon City, the families of people who died in various facility incidents across the globe, the communities whose water supplies and ecosystems were contaminated by Umbrella's research, all of them had claims against an organization that was being dissolved in legal proceedings. Whether those claims were honored, whether the institutional dissolution was structured to protect assets from those claims, or genuinely designed to provide remedy, is never addressed. This absence is consistent with the franchise's broader tendency to treat institutional accountability as something that happens off-screen and then focus on the next crisis. But the specific failure to show any genuine accounting for Umbrella's crimes contributes to the franchise's implicit argument that institutional evil of this scale cannot be meaningfully remedied by legal processes. That implicit argument may be the most disturbing thing in the entire franchise, and it is made primarily through what is left unsaid. What the STARS investigation actually found, the original STARS Bravo team was sent to investigate the series of cannibalistic murders in the Arklay Mountains in 1998. The Bravo team's investigation ended with most of them dying in or around the Spencer mansion. The Alpha team, sent to investigate the disappearance of Bravo, arrived at the mansion and experienced the events of the original Resident Evil. The surviving members, Chris, Jill, Barry, and Rebecca, escaped with evidence of Umbrella's involvement. The specific report they filed, the specific evidence they brought back, the specific legal and institutional response to that evidence in the immediate aftermath of their escape has never been shown in any game. We know the institutional response was inadequate because Raccoon City was not evacuated or quarantined in the months between July and October 1998. We know Wesker's position within Umbrella gave him the ability to suppress the Alpha team's findings at the STARS level. We know that the evidence Chris and Jill had was not sufficient to trigger a government-level response before the outbreak. But the specific chain of events, what they submitted, who reviewed it, what decisions were made at each level of institutional response, who decided that the evidence was insufficient or could be suppressed, why neither Chris nor Jill found a way to go directly to federal authorities rather than through STARS channels, all of this is the missing procedural chapter of the franchise's founding events. The gap between the survivors escaping the mansion in July and the city being bombed in October, everything that happened in those 3 months with the evidence they carried, is a story the franchise has never told. The missing time in Resident Evil 3. Jill Valentine survived the mansion incident in July 1998 and was in Raccoon City during the October outbreak. The 3 months between those events are almost entirely blank in the franchise's documentation. She was recovering physically. She was dealing with what she had experienced. She was presumably still trying to get someone in authority to act on what she knew about Umbrella. What was that 3-month period actually like? She was living in a city that Umbrella Corporation had an enormous institutional presence in, with evidence of that company's illegal research, trying to convince institutions that Umbrella had already corrupted that something needed to be done. She was living in the city that was going to be destroyed. She was trying to prevent that destruction, without the authority or resources to do so, and without the knowledge that the outcome was already determined. The Resident Evil 3 games begin the night the outbreak starts. They show you what Jill does during the crisis, not what she spent 3 months doing before it. But those 3 months, the specific texture of existing in a city that you know is sitting on top of a catastrophe that has not yet happened, trying to make people listen while the institutional walls close around you, is one of the most interesting periods in the franchise's history that no game has depicted. The medical response. Every major bioterrorism incident in the franchise produces significant casualties. Raccoon City produced approximately 100,000 deaths. Subsequent incidents in various games produce casualties that are described in the aggregate without individual accounting. The franchise is very good at showing the scale of these events through visual evidence of their aftermath, through the empty streets and abandoned buildings and scattered bodies that the protagonists move through. What it almost never shows is the medical response as it is happening. The field hospitals being established at the perimeter of the exclusion zone. The doctors and nurses working under conditions of incomplete information about what they are dealing with, treating patients whose symptoms do not match any known disease presentation, making triage decisions without understanding what is spreading the condition or how quickly it progresses. The specific experience of medical professionals encountering a T-virus outbreak from the outside, working with survivors who escaped the city, trying to understand what happened to them and what the risks are of continued contact. The medical response to Raccoon City, the specific institutional and professional challenge of dealing with a pathogen that produces symptoms no medical professional had ever encountered before, in patients who were potentially still infectious from an unknown agent, in conditions of extreme information scarcity and governmental pressure to contain the information, would constitute one of the most dramatically rich stories in the franchise that has never been told. The question of natural mutation, the T-virus, in various outbreak scenarios, has had time to circulate through isolated populations for extended periods. The Raccoon City outbreak ran for approximately 2 weeks before the city was destroyed. The incidents in other games involve contained populations over varying periods. In some cases, infected organisms have been isolated in environments where they have continued to exist and potentially evolve for years. Viruses mutate. This is their primary evolutionary mechanism. A T-virus strain that has been circulating through a population for weeks or months will be different from the strain that was initially deployed, because natural selection acts on viral populations the same way it acts on any other biological population. Variants that replicate more efficiently, that are more virulent, that are better adapted to their specific host environment will become dominant over time. What do older T-virus infections look like? Is there a meaningful difference between a T-virus zombie that was infected 2 weeks ago and one that has been infected for 2 years? The franchise tends to treat infected status as a fixed state, rather than as an ongoing biological process that continues developing. But biology does not freeze. The specific mutations that have developed in infected organisms that have been isolated in various environments since 1998 have never been examined. There might be an Arklay Mountains ecosystem somewhere out there that contains T-virus strains that have had 25 years to develop in isolation. What those strains look like, what they are capable of, is a question that does not have an answer anywhere in the franchise. The last unspoken conversation. Every character in Resident Evil has something they have never said to another character that defines their unspoken story. Jill Valentine and Barry Burton have never, in any game, fully discussed what happened in the Spencer mansion, what Barry's coercion by Wesker actually felt like from the inside, what Jill's experience of finding out that her team leader and a trusted colleague were both acting against her was really like. Chris and Claire Redfield's relationship, built across years of shared trauma and separated periods, and the specific horror of Raccoon City, has never been shown in any scene that goes beyond functional family loyalty into the complicated emotional territory of what they have both been through. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield survived Raccoon City together. They met in impossible circumstances. They helped each other through one of the worst nights in human history, and then they parted and spent the subsequent 2.5 decades living parallel lives in the same franchise, without any scene that directly addresses what that shared experience meant to either of them. Leon has faced life-ending threats multiple times since Raccoon City. Claire has faced them too. They have crossed paths in subsequent games. Neither of them has ever said what Raccoon City was. These unspoken conversations are not plot holes. They are the emotional residue of storytelling that prioritizes the next crisis over the psychological processing of the last one. They are the truths that the franchise's characters carry without speaking, the things that would require stillness to address, and the franchise does not often create stillness. The space where those conversations would happen, if anyone ever found the right moment in the right game, is one of the most human mysteries in a franchise that spends most of its time being inhuman in the most inventive ways possible. That is the nature of the Resident Evil franchise after 30 years. It is an archive of the unsaid, as much as it is a story of what happened. Every voiced mystery has a shadow mystery behind it, the unvoiced version of the same question, the personal and human version that runs parallel to the institutional and biological one. The Duke does not know what he is, but neither do most of the people in the franchise. Not fully, not in the ways that count when the lights go down and the world gets quiet enough to hear what you have been carrying. 50 questions, thousands of years of history, one ancient virus in a garden in West Africa, and everything that grew from it. That is the story. That has always been the story. The rest is just the specific shape the questions take on the way to the answers that are still coming. Final thoughts. Why these questions matter. We have spent a long time with these mysteries. 50 questions spread across 30 years of franchise history, each one pulling at a different thread, each one connected to the others in ways that become clearer the longer you sit with them. Before we close, it is worth asking the question that the mysteries themselves are built around. Why does it matter that these things remain unanswered? Why does the Resident Evil franchise's collection of unsolved puzzles feel like something more meaningful than simple narrative loose ends? The answer has to do with what the franchise has been doing all along, underneath the zombies and the corporate villains and the escalating bioterrorism scenarios. Resident Evil has always been a story about institutional failure, about the specific kind of damage that happens when powerful organizations decide that their goals justify their methods, when brilliant people convince themselves that the rules that protect ordinary human beings from being used as tools do not apply to research of sufficient importance. The progenitor virus is not the real horror of the franchise. The real horror is that Spencer found it, recognized its potential, and immediately began building the machine that would maximize the harm it could do. Every unsolved mystery in the franchise exists in the shadow of that original decision. The Indopaya civilization that developed around the stairway to the sunflowers did so in a context where the virus was sacred rather than commercial, where the mechanism for selecting who encountered it was embedded in community ritual and collective memory, rather than corporate research and eugenics programs. The specific horror of what Umbrella did is not simply that it was dangerous. It is that it took something that human beings had been relating to, carefully and wisely for thousands of years, and converted it into a product. The 50 mysteries are the questions that remain because that conversion produced consequences that have never been fully accounted for. The missing survivors, the unidentified soldiers, the organizations that are still collecting viral samples, the children who grew up in the ruins, the researchers who walked out of their labs in 2003, carrying knowledge that did not stop being dangerous simply because their employer ceased to exist. All of these things are the ongoing cost of Spencer's original decision, rippling forward through time in ways that the franchise keeps depicting without ever fully resolving. The Duke does not know what he is. Billy Cohen is somewhere out there with a criminal record he does not deserve. Natalia Corda is smiling a smile that might not be entirely her own. Ethan Winters is preserved in a fragment of fungal tissue in a government research facility. Rose is standing in the aftermath of her father's second death, watching a stranger approach her who knows where she is. These things are unresolved because the franchise is still going, because the story is still being written. Because the questions are not gaps but invitations, each one an open door into a room that has not yet been built, but will be if the franchise continues and the people telling these stories decide that the threads they planted deserve to be pulled. Until then, the questions remain. And in the particular quality of silence that follows everything we have been through tonight, that seems like exactly the right place to leave them. Not resolved, not abandoned, simply held, gently, in the dark. Like everything that the franchise has ever made you feel is still possible. The monsters will come back. They always do. But tonight, in this particular quiet, we are just asking questions. And the questions are enough. There is something ancient growing in the dark beneath the mountains. There always has been. Sleep well. The mysteries nobody talks about enough. Before the final sign-off, there are a handful of questions that fly under the radar of most franchise discussion, but deserve a moment of attention because they reveal something specific about how Resident Evil constructs its world. Why can no one cure the T-virus once infected? For a franchise built around a pharmaceutical corporation with extraordinary scientific resources, Resident Evil has a remarkably consistent absence of cures. The T-virus, once it has fully established itself in a human host, produces effects that are described as irreversible, You do not recover from being a zombie. The mutation process, once started, does not stop. All of Umbrella's research was aimed at controlling the mutation process, directing it, weaponizing it, never at stopping it, and returning the host to pre-infection baseline. This is a choice that Spencer embedded in the original research direction. The progenitor virus and its T-virus derivative were being studied as enhancement mechanisms, not as disease agents. You do not develop cures for things you consider benefits, but the T-virus, in virtually all its human subjects, does not produce enhancement. It produces a form of living death that destroys everything the person was. Did no one at Umbrella ever seriously pursue a cure for T-virus infection? The T103 inhibitor drug exists, which demonstrates that the mutation process can be chemically managed to some degree. The NNE alpha parasite suppressor that Leon uses in Resident Evil 4 to prevent his own plaga from maturing demonstrates that specific infection stages can be interrupted with targeted intervention. But a complete cure, a way to eliminate active T-virus infection and return a host to pre-infection biological status, does not exist anywhere in the franchise's documented history. Is it simply not possible? Or is it possible and simply was never prioritized because the commercial value of the T-virus lay in what it did to people, rather than in reversing what it had done? The absence of a cure is both a practical narrative choice that gives the franchise its stakes and an implicit comment on the research priorities of an organization that never saw the infected as people to be rescued. How do the infected navigate? This is a question that the games address through gameplay mechanics without ever addressing through lore. Zombies in the Resident Evil franchise have impaired but functional motor capacity. They can walk, reach, bite. They can navigate environments that include stairs, doors, and varied terrain. They appear to be attracted to sound and movement. Their sensory processing is damaged but not eliminated. But what does the internal experience of that navigation look like? The T-virus has destroyed higher cognitive function, while preserving enough of the brainstem to keep basic motor activity going. The organism is driven by a basic imperative toward protein consumption. When it moves toward a sound or a movement, what is the phenomenological character of that movement? Is there residual awareness behind the motor function, something that experiences the movement without being able to direct it? Or has the brain's capacity for any form of self-awareness been completely eliminated along with its higher functions? The franchise never addresses this because answering it would either diminish the horror of the zombie by making them pitiable, or intensify it by making them aware. The specific silence around the inner life of infected individuals is one of the few genuine philosophical evasions in a franchise that is otherwise willing to examine difficult questions about consciousness. The architectural secret of every major facility in the Resident Evil franchise was designed with secret rooms, hidden passages, and concealed areas. The Spencer Mansion was built by George Trevor with puzzles and hidden mechanisms at Spencer's direction. The Raccoon City Police Department building was originally an art museum whose original architecture was retained in its conversion. The various underground laboratories always have areas that are clearly not on any official floor plan. The repeated presence of hidden architectural spaces in every location the franchise visits is not random. It reflects a specific logic of the world, where every institution maintains spaces that are not supposed to exist, where the visible footprint of any organization substantially underrepresents what is actually there. The locked doors and blocked passages and hidden mechanisms are not simply gameplay elements. They are a consistent statement about how these institutions function, about the gap between what they present to the world and what they actually contain. The most interesting hidden architectural space in the franchise is the one that has never been found. The facility that exists but has not yet been visited. The hidden area of a previously explored location that no protagonist has ever reached. The specific room in the Spencer Mansion, or the Raccoon Police Department, or any of the subsequent game's environments that contains something the designers placed there and the camera has never shown. Whether anything like that exists is unknowable from the outside, but the franchise's architectural logic suggests that it does, somewhere. The question of what it contains is by definition unanswerable, which makes it somehow the purest version of a Resident Evil mystery, the one we cannot even properly state because we do not know where it is. The dog that survived in the original Resident Evil Kevin the dog was a member of STARS Bravo Team's unit. He survived the events of the game's early sections, found again in a cell where he had apparently been kept alive despite being near the source of T-virus infection in the kennel areas. Depending on which playthrough you complete, he can appear to assist the player at a crucial moment. Whether Kevin survived the mansion's destruction, whether a dog carrying some form of T-virus exposure made it out of the Arklay Mountains, has never been addressed in any subsequent game. This is a tiny detail compared to the franchise's larger unresolved questions. But Kevin represents something specific. The franchise's willingness to create emotional investment in characters who exist entirely at the margins, who have no dialogue and no agency and no documented fate, and to leave that investment unresolved as a matter of policy rather than oversight. Every small unresolved mystery in Resident Evil is Kevin. Every researcher whose journal ends mid-sentence, every background character whose face appears in a photograph found in an abandoned room, every name on a list that no game ever dramatizes. The franchise is full of these lives, acknowledged briefly and then left. Their accumulation is what makes the world feel genuinely populated, rather than simply constructed for the protagonists to move through. That quality, the sense of a world that has more history than any single game can show, more ongoing life than the camera ever captures, is what makes Resident Evil's unsolved mysteries feel substantial, rather than simply frustrating. The questions are evidence of depth. They are proof that there is more here than any single visit can exhaust. And as long as there is more, there is reason to come back. A note on living with unanswered questions. 30 years is a long time to sit with anything. The Resident Evil franchise has been running long enough that some of the people who played the original game as teenagers are now in their 40s. The questions the series has planted across its history have had decades to develop in the minds of the people who care about this world. Some of those questions have become permanent residents in the imagination of the franchise's most dedicated followers, thought about so frequently that the thinking itself has become a kind of relationship with the material. This is not unique to Resident Evil. Any long-running narrative that is built with enough internal consistency to reward close attention will eventually produce a community of people who know the world better in some respects than the people who made it. They will find the inconsistencies. They will identify the threads that were planted and not followed. They will develop theories that are more coherent than the official explanations for events the source material left ambiguous. What is specific to Resident Evil is the particular quality of its unsolved mysteries. Most of the questions we have explored tonight are not gaps or oversights. They are deliberate constructions, mysteries placed with craft and intention by writers who understood that the unanswered question is often more powerful than the answer. The Duke's admission that he does not know what he is works precisely because it is not answered. The figure in green picking up the broken vial works precisely because the camera does not follow them out of the room. The smile on Natalia's face works precisely because the game ends there. These deliberate mysteries create a relationship between the franchise and its audience that is different from simply following a plot. They create investment that persists beyond any individual game's ending, questions that are still alive the next time you think about them, still generating new angles and new possibilities with each return. The unanswered question is the franchise's longest-running character, present in every entry, never fully resolved, always there when you look for it. There is something genuinely comfortable about spending time with questions that do not require resolution to be meaningful. The best mysteries are not the ones that finally click into place with a satisfying answer. They are the ones that keep opening, that reveal new implications with each examination, that are somehow more interesting for remaining unsolved than they would be if Capcom published a document tomorrow explaining everything. These 50 questions are companions for the long game. They will still be there the next time a new entry is announced. They will still be there in the first hours of playing it, shaping the lens through which you experience whatever new information the game provides. They will still be there in the conversations afterward, between people who notice the same things and notice them differently. The lights are down. The questions are here. The franchise is still being written. Whatever comes next will answer some of these things and raise new ones. That is the nature of a story that is still alive, which means there will always be more to talk about. Until next time. And if you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know the answer to the only question that actually matters right now. Drop a like if any of these made you think. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And somewhere in the comments, leave the mystery that has been living in the back of your head since the first time you played one of these games. The one you keep coming back to. The one that still has no satisfying answer. They are all welcome here.